All right, good morning, everybody. First and foremost, thank you for joining us at the Atlantic Council for this important and timely event on Iran. My name is Brookie. I'm the director and managing editor of the Digital Forensic Research Lab here at the Atlantic Council. And on behalf of the DFR Lab, as well as the Atlantic Council's Middle East Programs and Future of Iran Initiative, I'm excited to welcome you to this three-part event. Whether you're joining in the room or whether you're on the live stream, it's literally my job being the director of something entitled Digital at the Atlantic Council to tell you to use the hashtag #ACIran. We will start today with a panel on Iranian digital influence efforts. We will then hear from Congressman Will Hurd on hybrid threats in the region. Congressman Hurd was an expert on these issues while serving in government prior to being elected from the 23rd District of Texas, and has been a leading and forceful voice on Iran's malign activity in the region and internationally. Very importantly, we will then take a very quick break for lunch. And finally, we'll return for a panel of journalists discussing the challenge of reporting on Iran from afar. The common thread of today's events is better understanding Iran's or the Iranian government's position in a global competition for information, which plays out in different ways, both internationally, where information operations fall, as well as domestically, where independent journalists reporting on events important to the Iranian street focus. Given the protests across Iran in December, as well as the escalation with the United States in the aftermath of Soleimani's death, we could not be having this discussion at a more important time. For the first panel, Iran has invested significant resources and accumulated vast experience in conducting information operations. Those overt and covert efforts have been used as a complement essentially to extend foreign policy from Iran for the better part of a decade. However, Iranian influence capabilities have gone largely unstudied in the United States. There's not that many people that know a lot about that, outside of this room in particular. But today we are extremely proud to release a policy brief. If you haven't seen it, I believe there's copies just outside, on Iranian digital influence efforts, subtitle Guerilla Broadcasting for the 21st Century. And it's by Emerson Brooking, who is a resident fellow here at the DFR Lab, and Suzanne Kianpour, who is a non-resident fellow with the Middle East Programs, but also a very well-known journalist on these issues. And they're here to discuss their findings. Please join me in welcoming Simin Kargar, who's joining us from the School of Advanced Studies at Johns Hopkins, who will be moderating this panel today. So thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Simin Kargar. I'm a PhD researcher at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. My research focuses on information warfare in the Middle East. I will be moderating this first panel on Iran's digital influence efforts. This is a timely conversation to have as we increasingly hear that Iranian assets are identified and being taken down by companies such as Facebook and Twitter. It's also timely because Iran just celebrated its 41st anniversary yesterday, and that's the time that Iran has historically ramped up its propaganda. Over the past decades, Iran has had a complicated relationship with the media and the internet. On one hand, it perceives the unfettered flow of information as a threat that can undermine the foundation of the revolution. On the other, Iran has actively sought to leverage traditional media and digital platforms for promoting its geopolitical interests. So today, we have two of the most knowledgeable individuals on the topic who will help us better understand Iran's influence efforts, how we got here, and what we can do to mitigate the harm of these efforts. On my immediate left, we have Emerson Brooking. Emerson is a resident fellow at the Digital Forensic Lab of the Atlantic Council. He's the co-author of Like War, The Weaponization of Social Media. It's a great book. Recommend it. Next to Emerson, we have Suzanne Kianpour. She's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, working with the Middle East programs and the DFR lab. She is also a foreign affairs and political journalist with the BBC and a lecturer on public diplomacy at UCLA. So without further ado, let's get to it. I'm going to start with you, Suzanne. Help us set the stage. Why does Iran engage in propaganda and information warfare in the first place? What's the mentality and sort of justification for these media operations?
So Iran, basically propaganda and information warfare is an arm of Iran's public. It's an arm of Iran's public diplomacy, and it's effectively how it projects itself to the world. And it's important to remember that the ethos of the Islamic Republic is conflict and survival. It was born out of what's been called the cassette revolution. That's actually the first chapter of a new book called The Black Wave by my former colleague Kim Gattas, who, shameless plug, I'm plugging her book now. It's a great read to really learn about the kind of beginnings of the Islamic Republic and its rivalry with Saudi Arabia. But propaganda played a big role in the birth of the Islamic Republic, and 41 years ago. And therefore it will continue to play a role in its survival. And it's important to kind of think about Iran's place in the world and why it needs to necessarily use information warfare rather than what we would maybe call public diplomacy. And that's because it kind of sees itself as at odds with, it's kind of on the back foot. It's at odds, it's at war with the US in particular in all sort of different forms, if not in a kinetic form, even though we almost saw the US and Iran go into what seemed to be almost kinetic war in January. But it engages in information warfare because, again, the conflict and struggle is part of who it is. It's part of its identity. So information warfare is part of it. It's kind of psychological operations. It's like Persian mind games, so to speak. And so it's at the core of the Republic, the Islamic Republic's toolkit. But since the JCPOA, we've seen a kind of evolution of how that public diplomacy, how that information warfare has evolved, which is what our report is really about. It's a lot of different angles. But the JCPOA, one Iranian official told me that the JCPOA put Iran on the map. And so back on the map, so to speak. But the methods of the kind of information warfare has been something that's needed to evolve and be creative because they want to stay on the map and they also want to be in more parts of the map, frankly.
Yeah. Emerson, would you like to add something?
And yeah, to that I'll add, Iran engages in these sorts of activities because it really doesn't have a choice. I'm not the regional expert on the stage, but I am very interested in why certain nations adopt these sorts of tactics and why, or how and why. And really, you can go all the way back to 1501. Iran from the beginning has faced powers which it's conventionally at odds. First it was the Ottomans, then the Russians, then the British, and then most recently the United States. And because they've always been a conventional parity or on the back foot, there's always been a need to invest in these asymmetric influence capabilities.
Great. So to kind of expand on that, can you tell us who Iran's agents are who have traditionally engaged in media operations and how do they actually operate? I'm going to start with you again.
Well, Iran is engaged in kind of a multi-front information war. The agents vary. They are as kind of prominent and open and overt as the Supreme Leader himself on Twitter, and the Foreign Minister Zarif is very active on Twitter, also tweeting in other languages, as recently as in Chinese. The Supreme Leader has accounts in other languages as well, English, Farsi, Spanish. But then there's also, and we go very deeply into this in the report, which I will throw over to Emerson on this, but there's other elements, other agents, as in the Islamic Republic's state broadcasting, IRIB, which has its own huge, massive apparatus. But then there are kind of sort of patriotic troll farms. There are sock puppets and websites that seem to disseminate or redisseminate or repurpose state broadcasting. So, I mean, it's incredibly diverse, and it's why we decided that this report was frankly necessary, because it's unlike Russian information operations in the sense that, you know, I cover the Russia investigation extensively, whereas the Russians kind of use the provokatsia mindset, the kind of confuse and dismay the enemy. The Iranian information operation is more so persuasive. And so that's something that we see in the different agents that are used to disseminate information all around the world through various means.
Yeah. And to that I'll add something that really stood out to me in the course of writing and researching this report was the IRIB. Because modern Iran was born from control of information, because the revolution had been so reliant on information flows to achieve its objective against, a government that was conventionally superior. The control of information is hardwired, written into the Iranian constitution. It's not the secular elected government, but the supreme leader, who personally appoints the head of the IRIB. And on top of the IRIB, there's a number of media apparatuses also controlled by the office of the supreme leader, and of course a number of media apparatuses which are directly controlled by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. But IRIB alone has, I think, 30 or 40 different outlets and broadcast media, and it broadcasts in about 20 languages internationally. IRIB, at least until recently, had a yearly budget of about $600 million a year. That's roughly on par with the U.S. Agency for Global Media, formerly known as the Broadcasting Board of Governors. But as a proportion of government spending on this sorts of state broadcasting, Iran was spending about 40 to 50 times more than the United States in these efforts. That shows how absolutely pivotal and central these sorts of investments are. And when we look at the range of actors that engage specifically in digital influence efforts and operations, a lot of it really is the IRIB expanding into Facebook and Twitter, because the IRIB has been, since 2013, and then with new force in 2018, sanctioned by the US. They really have limited access to the digital information space. That in large part explains why they've turned to Twitter botnets and to sock puppets and to a range of fabricated websites which purport to be local media outlets, but which almost invariably launder and plagiarize Iranian state media content. And as you look...
It's basically repurposed.
Right. And if you kind of look at the way these actors operate in the space, you can almost imagine a bunch of state bureaucrats in a room trying to meet a daily quota for, how many stories they share or how many accounts they're running. There's a level of routinization in these sorts of efforts that I haven't really seen in studying the influence apparatus of any other country. Totally separate from that, and maybe we can dig more into it, is a highly sophisticated, targeted influence operations in which certain Iranian actors have engaged in sophisticated social engineering. They've created facsimiles of different media outlets, written convincing stories, which seem to have been published by these outlets, then reached out to individual US-based Middle East experts and journalists to try to seed these false stories through the information environment. This, again, is sophisticated stuff, and it seems to me so different from the bulk of Iranian activities that you could suppose these sorts of things originate with either Iranian intelligence services or a branch of the IRGC, and in fact these efforts may not be coordinated with each other.
Well, and they have to be kind of so sophisticated and organized because the ultimate goal is to spread, Iran's ultimate goal is to spread its influence as far and wide as possible. So it's strategic. I mean, they have a battle plan.
And you can actually look, after the 2009 Green Movement, Green Revolution, Khamenei gave a series of speeches on the pivotal importance of influence operations, or what Iranians conceive of as this soft war. And he said, almost verbatim, basically, we need more marketing guys. We need people who can do Photoshop. And there was of course, if the Supreme Leader's saying it, it's going to get done. There was a huge bureaucratic investment in these sorts of capabilities. And I think that investment going back to 2009 largely explains these big influence networks that we're only now beginning to uncover.
So I'm glad you mentioned the point about spendings. With such extensive propaganda apparatus, how would you evaluate the success of these operations, both domestically and later on we're going to get to the international aspect of it? Suzanne?
Well, I mean, if I can, internationally first.
Mm-hmm.
Just kind of overtly, Foreign Minister Zarif is a very effective operator, and naturally that has gotten the attention of the administration and hawkish senators like Senator Ted Cruz, which is why they've been calling on having his Twitter account getting shut down, because they see that, you know, this is part of their battle plan and it may or may not be working. But, you know, we've seen an uptick since, I would say since the U.S. left the JCPOA in May of 2018, we've seen an uptick of kind of media interviews with Western media, so the Iranian officials doing interviews with prominent Western journalists and going on primetime shows and speaking directly to the American people on Fox News, for example, to the point where Secretary Pompeo aired his grievances last summer and said, well, I wish I could speak directly to the Iranian people, which they could. I mean, there are ways to do that, but that doesn't seem like they have really taken advantage of that the way the Iranians have. So the American government hasn't taken advantage of the avenues that are at their disposal the way the Iranian government has in terms of traditional channels. Domestically, I'll let Emerson speak.
Sure. So, yeah, let's divide this into U.S.-focused and then international spheres. I would not characterize Iranian operations targeting the U.S. as particularly effective, and they absolutely pale in comparison to the known Russian efforts. Iranians haven't gotten folks on two sides of a domestic protest out in the streets up in arms against each other. And from what we can see, that's not really the intent anyway. Instead, and we try to emphasize this again and again in the report, the real intent of these Iranian influence operations is to put out that counter-narrative, one that sees Iran as resisting the forces of neocolonialism, one that sees Iran as basically an alternative religious and Islamic pole in the Middle East, and one that specifically sees Iran as the leader of the anti-US resistance. But we see, I think, the most success of those efforts in their Spanish language programming, in the significant investments they made in messaging to West Africa, and particularly to Nigeria. The fact that the IRIB operated a huge network of sock puppet Facebook accounts that targeted Bengali-speaking audiences in India. And there I think they've had more success, and one anecdote that really pops out to me there is there was a huge India-based Facebook page. I think it had about 1 million followers. And it was removed by Facebook about a year ago because it had been laundering a lot of IRIB, Iranian state media content. We thought for a time that this was just an Iranian propaganda front operating in India. What now appears more likely is that this was a bunch of Indians running a news outlet who needed some extra content. So they were kind of on their own, taking from this free IRIB stuff. And that way, Iranian messaging was entering a part of the world that it wouldn't have otherwise. So I think this stuff is effective in sowing counter-narratives beyond the U.S. I don't think it's particularly effective in changing American perspectives.
I think there are also, I mean, it seems a little bit new to really say how effective it actually is. One thing to look at or to think about is, naturally Iran is under all kinds of sanctions. And somewhere where the digital efforts, in terms of at least shaping public opinion or at least affecting public opinion, where it could be perhaps more effective, is in Europe. But that's because they're kind of historically sort of more predispositioned to not necessarily feel as strongly or have such a hard line towards Iran as the US, for example. But another thing to think about in terms of why they have this operation, and to the extent that they have this operation, is they need to find ways to skirt sanctions, which they openly talk about the fact that they will. And so it's also an economic issue and a matter of business.
Yeah. It seems that there's a lot of strategy going into these operations in terms of design and execution, unlikely targets such as in India, Bengali speakers, Nigeria. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit here, and I want to turn to Emerson to talk to us a little bit about what changed with the internet and all these other digital tools that the Iranians now have in their hands. You mentioned sanctions. You mentioned how they're using sock puppets and different tactics. But from a broader, give us an overview or strategic perspective as why Iran may engage or is engaging in digital operations.
Oh, happily. If you go back to the early 90s, Iran was actually just the second country in the Middle East after Israel to embrace the internet and to hook up their state universities to the international system. And what's fascinating is if you look back in the early 90s, the Iranian government thought that the internet would be a way to spread Islamic scripture and a way for Iran to communicate to the world in a new way, and a new way for it to basically reinforce its existing propaganda apparatus. But there weren't really even that many concerted efforts at censorship in the first 5 years of the Iranian internet. Things really began to change in the early 2000s. But even then, and Suzanne can speak more to it, but when Ahmadinejad ran as a conservative candidate in the mid-2000s, one of his platforms was actually making the internet more open and free again. And the Iranians have always been sophisticated internet users and have always wanted that connection to the broader world. Of course, things changed decisively in 2009 with the Green Revolution or Green Movement. This showed the power that activists had when they could use these Western social media platforms, Facebook and Twitter, to coordinate, to ensure international coverage, and to ensure that the state couldn't easily disrupt their movement. This was the great promise of social media. And United States policymakers, seeing how pivotal Twitter especially was to these folks, actually interceded. When Twitter had a planned maintenance period, Twitter was going to shut down for a few crucial hours. U.S. policymakers intercede. They say, Twitter, stay up. The role you're playing right now is too important. So this, in the short term, helps strengthen those democratic activists more. But in the long term, the Iranian government does reassert control. There is a crackdown. And particularly because of that U.S. intercession, these platforms that have been viewed with growing suspicion were now seen firmly as part of U.S. information operations against Iran. And as an aside, if you look at military general publications in Russia or China, their tone regarding social media also changes decisively in 2009. That's the year when a lot of nations that we would characterize as U.S. adversaries began to understand that they needed to make significant information warfare investments because they saw that the West had already made those investments, even as we saw Silicon Valley as something totally removed from an instrument of our own foreign policy ends. So after 2009, it was the announced creation of cyber brigades. IRCG develops significant influence capabilities. IRIB expands into a number of digital properties. And at the same time, Iran also begins to develop capabilities to remove the country from the broader global internet. And at first, it was called the halal internet. And at first, folks kind of made fun of it. And progress on the project was pretty slow. But fast forward to 2019, in November, Iran killed about 1,500 protesters. Iran also managed to shut down internet access almost entirely in the country for days, stopping any international observation or effective coordination of those protesters domestically. So,
which was the largest in history.
Right. And so we see now that Iran has come to terms with the internet, understands the danger to the Iranian government, and indeed has begun to make these major offensive investments.
So the internet was kind of, at first, I mean, like Emerson said, Iran was an early adopter of the internet, just behind Israel. And it was kind of a blessing and a curse, right? Because it's like Iran's relationship with the internet is paradoxical the way Iran's identity itself is. It has like this rich digital culture, but at the same time it's at odds with its religious authority. And one of my first trips to Iran, it was summer 2005, and I was there for Ahmadinejad's, or when he was elected, but I was there in the lead up to the elections, and I mean the city was abuzz. The men's national team had just qualified for the 2006 World Cup, and people were super excited about this guy who wanted to make the internet accessible for all, and he wore a suit and didn't wear clerical garb, and people were excited about Ahmadinejad, and he was elected, and then we saw what happened afterwards. But I guess the halal internet is now, they say it's 80% complete. We'll see. Yeah.
And just to add to, when we think about Iran's relationship with the internet, I'd encourage you, if you haven't already, please grab a copy of our report, but specifically just look at the cover that we chose. And there's a reason for it. This cover just shows a number of Iranian citizens taking pictures in front of anti-American murals. These murals were unveiled last year on the 40th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution. These murals are actually on the former U.S. Embassy in Tehran. It's now a museum. It's called, official name, the Den of American Espionage. It sounds very interesting. But you see everyday citizens just taking photos in front of these murals. And that's because the murals are almost certainly designed for Instagram and for digital media. If you look at these murals and compare them to, say, some of the wall murals in Los Angeles, where every wannabe Instagram influencer snaps photos in front of them, the two look kind of similar. So this really communicates the fact that Iranian government, Iranian authorities are much more savvy to digital influence than they were a few years ago. It also illustrates the fact that Iranians still love the internet, that there are still right now 24 million Iranian Instagram users, that under the radar there are still about 40 million Iranians who have some access at least to Facebook, that they continue to want to participate in this global digital environment, but sometimes have to take surreptitious means to do so.
It's interesting that you mentioned Instagram, because when Iran started doing a harassment and trolling campaign of domestic dissidents, Instagram was one of the prolific platforms that they turned to. And this was in fact a study that I did and published last year, where we showed how active Iranian agents are on new platforms such as Instagram. So I'm wondering, when we're talking about Iran's influence operations on different platforms, have you seen different trends on, let's say, Twitter versus Facebook versus Instagram? where are they most active or seem to be targeting different segments of their audiences?
I'm happy to start. It's tough when you're doing this sort of digital forensic work to get a sense of the scale of any of these influence operations. It's really challenging when you're trying to study platforms like Facebook, where we don't have access to the bulk of the activity there, and we only find out about it retroactively. The most information we have regards Iranian activities on Twitter. And that's because Twitter's released a large data set that you can model and figure out these bot and sock puppet account creation dates and then different levels of activity and when there's a big spike. And what's fascinating is when you map out these 8.5 million tweets that have been affirmatively linked to Iranian state influence apparatus, you see there are two big increases in activity. The first one is the summer of 2015, a time when U.S. was consumed with debate over whether to ratify or allow the JCPOA to go into force after a final deal had been negotiated and proposed to U.S. and European domestic audiences. That's the first big spike. The second, even bigger spike took place in early and mid-2018 when President Trump announced his intentions to withdraw from the JCPOA, and then when that went into force 3 months later. That, I think, really demonstrates that Iran uses this apparatus to complement very specific foreign policy objectives, which in this case was, at least at the time, rapprochement with the United States and the pursuit of a nuclear program as permitted by the international community. One suspects that there are similar patterns of activity if you were to look at the extent of their Facebook influence activities. And one thing I'll add, it's a small data set, so it's tough to draw many affirmative conclusions, but Iran was active on Reddit, and it was active specifically in this very, very big subreddit devoted to the Syrian civil war. And if you look at the posts there, again, these were posts that were basically pushing content in favor of Assad.
Suzanne,
Well, following on your point about pushing kind of foreign policy objectives, it's not just, it's not just the U.S.-Iran conflict. Again, Iran's aim is to, in its information influence operations, is to expand its influence around the world. And let's take that and kind of bring it back to just the Middle East, for example. I mean, the narratives and stuff that they push out is also kind of anti-Sunni Arab. It's anti-U.S. involvement in the Middle East. They also, have been known to help push kind of conspiracy theories. And what we haven't really talked about, I think, is the sort of difference between their use of disinformation versus misinformation, whereas, Russian information operations have been known to just have completely false stories very often. I'm not saying that Iranian content, there hasn't been completely false stories that they've pushed out or created or helped push out, but more likely or more often than not, there is this kind of manipulating the information, kind of distorting it just enough to kind of fit their narrative. And one of these examples was when I was based in Beirut in 2014. That was, ISIS was wreaking havoc in the region. And there was this one story that was just all over Lebanon. And it was that Hillary Clinton admitted in her book that the U.S. created ISIS. And it was everywhere. I mean, this former intelligence official that I was having lunch with was talking about it. This cab driver was talking about it. And then, later we started to see that these sort of stories have had ties to kind of part of the information operations that Iran, the narratives that Iran pushed out in the region, because it later, as we saw, Iran was seen as this kind of almost, they were pushing out the idea that they were this savior against ISIS, and those kinds of stories help their narrative. So again, it's about pushing out their foreign policy initiatives wherever in the world that might be.
And would you say that the mediums they use in order to disseminate that sort of propaganda depend on the context? You mentioned Lebanon, and we know that Iran runs an Arabic television, Al Alam, and Al Manar of Hezbollah is probably also receiving support. I'm wondering, when we're talking about context and specifically the Middle East, is it usually television propaganda that works best, or it doesn't really matter?
I mean, I think they're incredibly savvy and sophisticated in the sense that they recognize that there isn't like a one-size-fits-all approach. And so they're aware of their audience. And I think that's why they're so broadly stretched, whether it's Reddit to Instagram to Twitter to Facebook. I mean, we don't know if they're on TikTok yet, but that's our next study.
And the fingerprints on these sorts of messaging, though, is like they're often quite apparent. Another example that really stands out to me, and something that I think the community would characterize as a U.S.-focused Iranian influence operation, was a fairly big Facebook page called BLM News, or Black Lives Matter News. It's obviously trying to harness potent U.S. social political movement and then try to latch onto that. If this was a Russian operation, that sort of page would have been used to demonize the U.S. administration, or to condemn racism in the U.S. writ large, or to fabricate fake stories that were linked to the Black Lives Matter movement. However, because this was an Iranian page, instead the page mostly shared stories about how great Hezbollah was in Lebanon, or the ills of U.S. sanctions policy overseas, which is an interesting choice if you're trying to market specifically to the Black Lives Matter community, but it shows the fact that there's a lot more single-mindedness and focus on pursuit of pretty discrete and clear foreign policy objectives, as opposed to other actors in this space.
Do you have other examples of how they engage with the U.S. Audience in particular, and what sort of engagement they receive?
So I'll turn back to Twitter. Not so much now, but especially in 2014, 2015, as Iranians were beginning to try this online influence and target American audiences. They basically conducted a lot of spam attacks. They'd have a website that would plagiarize an IRIB or Iranian state media article, and then they'd just absolutely bombard both journalists and regular users with it. They were always trying to get traffic to their websites. Now I think there is a bit more advancement, a bit more sophistication in how they conduct those sorts of operations. They're the developed false identities. There's the social engineering. There's trying to seed their perspective across the information environment in
There's
a more
also
natural
building
way.
relationships.
Definitely.
In what way?
Well, the kind of, when they're targeting people on Twitter, for example, that they're trying to sort of plant these stories on, formally, it was sort of like you were just getting bombarded. And this is almost, I mean, Emerson can speak on a brighter scale. I'm kind of speaking from experience that then when we were doing this study, I said, oh, that looks really familiar. Before it was kind of, you would get bombarded with this information, and it later, when it became clear that, this was part of a wider operation, it seems that they've changed their tactics in a sense that it's more targeted and it's more strategic, and it's the longer game, rather than let's just like throw all of this information at people, or let's just spam everybody and see what sticks.
Another trend that we've seen over and over on the Iranian domestic side of things is how quickly they respond to topics of the day. You see a journalist post about the Pride Parade in London, for example, and there's a swarm of attacks against that specific journalist. So I'm wondering if and to what extent you've seen that sort of trend against international audiences.
Would you like to?
You go.
Sure. Of course. Sorry, that's what I meant to mention before. So in addition to this sorts of spam attacks that are just trying to get audience share, to go back to Iranian state broadcasting. And then the more sophisticated social engineering stuff. We've tracked recently, especially on Instagram, the rise of what could only be characterized as kind of information show of force operations. This influence analyst Cindy Otis calls it digital flexing. And this is when there's no attempt at all to hide the origin of these sorts of messages. Instead, it's spam attacks with the intent to intimidate and to show power. When Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was holding what he characterized as a regional peace conference in February of last year, his Instagram page was absolutely bombarded with Iranian flags and death to Americas and all that sort of stuff. After the U.S. killing of Soleimani in January, same thing happened. There was a number of death to Americas, of images of American coffins that were tagged to the White House and to different members of the Trump family. That stuff's not trying to hide its origin, not trying to hide its identity, but is really trying to tell U.S. audiences in the world that Iran still has this power, regardless of how many sanctions you throw at it.
Okay. Do you have other examples?
I think he pretty much summed it up.
Great. So aside from the operations that are kind of obvious and related or have originated in Iran, how do you go about dealing with the question of attribution when it comes to identifying influence operations? I'm going to start with you because you're the expert on this.
Unfortunately, you don't. You have a good idea. If you're an independent researcher, you can draw out a lot from political context and from your knowledge of the situation on the ground. But the only surefire attribution we get is from these technology companies, and usually Facebook and Twitter, or from a trusted intelligence service, because they have access to signals intelligence and to other information that you would never have, no matter how good of an open source researcher and analyst you were. And in fact, one of our recommendations in the report is that on this issue of attribution, there should be more affirmative attributions conducted by elements of the US government. The fact that virtually every data set, everything we have in this report, comes voluntarily from Twitter and Facebook to private companies who have tracked and released information on operations that are targeting the American and global public, that seems almost an unacceptable role for solely private and corporate entities to be playing. There should be more public involvement and government involvement in this sorts of attribution processes.
So from a journalist perspective, I mean, ever since 2016 in particular, there has been a massive uptick in kind of trying to train every journalist to kind of have a keen eye for the source, the origination of material, the sources. I mean, the BBC has entire units dedicated to this. And so, I mean, it's really, I think, as they get more sophisticated, we as journalists get more sophisticated, and hopefully the US government gets more sophisticated.
Yeah. Do you think the media have done enough to prepare themselves for the evolution of threats that may be coming and obviously getting more sophisticated?
I mean, I don't want to say something that's going to end up getting my foot in my mouth. Like, yeah, we're totally prepared. But I think that we as the media are doing as much as we can to be prepared, and the good thing out of what happened in 2016 is that we're far more vigilant than we ever really were, I would say. And so everyone we already as journalists are supposed to take things with a healthy dose of skepticism, but I think that now the skepticism has different lenses, and so we look at things from different points of view, and like I said, we're just kind of far more vigilant.
So you mentioned a couple times the differences between Russian operations and the Iranian side of things. Obviously, Russians have engaged in a lot more disinformation and kind of neutral, playing both sides of the story. What we've seen on the Iranian domestic side is that they kind of get more sophisticated over time and eventually enter the realm of disinformation and like really hard attacks against communities of journalists, LGBT activists, and so on. So I'm wondering if it's a matter of time until Iran evolves its tactics into something that can be identified as pure disinformation rather than strategic outreach and media operations.
I would think that it would depend on whether or not they think that their method and modus operandi is working. Whereas the kind of Russian aim was to sow discord and kind of divide the country, divide the U.S. and kind of pit us at each other's throats, so to speak. The Iranians, like we've been saying, is the Iranians want to persuade and present themselves in a particular way. I mean, they want the Persian Empire back. Like that's the crux of all of this. They want that power and influence back. So I think it's difficult to say because them switching up their playbook would require seeing some sort of evidence that what they're doing isn't working. Whereas I think right now it's also difficult to say how much it is working. I think, like I said before, the one definitely effective, and when I say effective, I think it's because we're talking about it and it seems to be getting under the U.S. government's skin, and that's the media kind of just blitz that the Foreign Minister Zarif did in the last 18 months. So I think we don't have an answer to your question yet.
Fair enough. Let's turn to the audience and take a few questions. I think we have 15 minutes or so. Barbara. We have mics around the room. Please say your name and affiliation. Thank you.
Hi, Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. Thank you. It's a really interesting report. I guess my basic question is, what's so nefarious about this? It seems like the standard sort of thing a government would do to defend itself. Can you speak a little bit about U.S. government efforts to counter this, and particularly the Iran Disinfo project? And finally, do you think Twitter should ban Ayatollah Khamenei and Minister Zarif, or would that be a violation of Twitter's commitment to freedom of speech? 3 easy questions.
Well, the Disinformation project definitely didn't do the U.S. government any favors. The Disinformation project essentially targeted U.S. journalists and that were seen as kind of pro-Iranian government. And so that definitely didn't do the U.S. government.
Without evidence, right?
Without...
They were seen as pro-regime.
Yes, they were. Yeah,
evidence.
Exactly. Who were seen as thank you. Who were seen as pro-Iranian government by the government, or by the U.S. government rather. So by the State Department, I suppose. So that didn't go over well, and that doesn't help. That doesn't help the U.S. government's desires to win the hearts and minds of Iranian people and the Iranian diaspora. Your question about whether or not it's nefarious, I think that just depends on who you're speaking to. Yes, everybody, I mean, it's governments. I mean, I taught an entire course about this. I taught an entire public diplomacy course at UCLA. Governments use all kinds of different channels to push their message and present themselves to the world. And we have mapped out various pillars and ways that the Iranian government presents itself to the world. Whether or not it's nefarious, again, has to do with who you're speaking to. I think nefarious activities, I mean, we would have to say, how did that content affect people? What were the results of it? Was it nefarious content that led to nefarious activities? I don't know. Was there another question?
No.
Oh, Twitter.
Should they be allowed to?
So as an objective journalist, I'm going to refrain from answering that question.
Well, first, I'd characterize the Iranian disinformation project this way.
American
Yes.
disinformation.
Yes. as Americans, our taxpayer dollars were used to target and harass American activists and American journalists who were viewed to have a perspective contrary to that of the current administration State Department. That's how I'd characterize that. I think it was certainly ineffective and contrary to the aims of good counter-messaging practices against Iran, and it drew more broadly into question the mission and focus of the Global Engagement Center. That's what I'd say about that. And the question of Twitter and how many is interesting. But I think that if Twitter endeavors to be a global platform for international relations and leaders, and if it is judged, as currently seems to be the case, that the Iranian state presence on these platforms is not violative of U.S. sanctions, that these accounts should remain in effect. And I want to contrast Twitter's current dilemma with what happened with Facebook a few weeks ago. So in the aftermath of the U.S. assassination of General Soleimani, it was judged that broad expressions in support of Soleimani by Iranian Instagram users were in violation of U.S. sanctions, and therefore Iranian journalists and citizens who wrote those sorts of messages their messages were removed or they were banned from the Instagram platform. That also struck me as deeply unproductive and counter to our interests. If we really want to invest in effective counter-messaging capabilities against Iran, pressuring our social media platforms to remove Iranian citizens from these services, in the case of Instagram, the sole link between Iranian citizens and the global internet, is stupid and malpractice.
There are a couple questions here.
Hi, thank you. I just would like to pose a question, piggybacking off of that. I mean, a lot of what in your report beautifully details is how Iran made facsimiles, fake Harvard Belfer Center, fake Atlantic articles, having fake news, stories that are not real in order to sow discord and to confuse people and to persuade people. So fake news. So is that not nefarious? Can we not say fake news is nefarious, or a lot of their operations are they spam dissidents or hack them? Like, is that not nefarious? So I think we can make a distinction between American activities and nefarious fake news and spamming dissidents and harassing people. I would think that qualifies as nefarious, regardless of where you stand on the spectrum of things.
Would you like to respond?
Well, I agree. That's why I try to avoid labels like nefarious when describing these activities, because a label like nefarious is so inherently subjective. And the fact is
fake news, is that subjective? Fake news is bad?
What is the fake news? I mean, I think that's a very good question.
Fake Atlantic website is not fake news. And a fake
Well,
story, is that not fake news? Something that didn't happen, they reported that like certain ministers said certain things that didn't happen. Is that not fake news?
no, that is fake news and that is
okay.
nefarious. To give you a specific example along those lines, there was a fake story planted by an Iranian fabricated website, which was, I believe, cited by a former Pakistani Minister of Defense, which led to a brief threat of nuclear use between Pakistan and Israel, all as a result of a fake story. I'd certainly characterize
That's
something
nefarious.
like that as nefarious. Right. But what we want to do, and as we outline in this report that everyone please grab a copy of, is that this sort of more sophisticated false news sowing is one part of a much broader influence operation that one could not characterize entirely as nefarious. You have to be nuanced when you're talking about these different aspects of digital influence operations, because I think they're going to be more and more commonplace as we look forward in the years ahead, and it will be important to be clear-eyed about what is malicious and what is not. And I think just most broadly on the nefarious point, what I characterize as nefarious is the sorts of Russian activities that targeted us in 2016. cases in which you have people masquerading as citizens of another country who attempt to steer electoral outcomes or foment violence when in fact they have no stake in that democratic process. That is fundamentally nefarious, and I think the thing that we at the Atlantic Council fight most vehemently against.
I agree.
Let's take a couple questions from the back.
Hello, my name is Arash Alaei from Iran International TV. Iran International TV is an independent TV in London, and we've been recently harassed and threatened by the Iranian regime. Our journalists have been harassed. Also, we've been threatened, some of our journalists have been threatened to be snatched from London. And my question is that it seems that there has been so far no reaction from the independent journalists, from the researchers from the United States, on the harassments of independent journalists, especially Iranians who reside outside Iran, namely Iran International representatives. And for us to be an independent channel, we try to cover a variety of stories, especially the Atlantic Council events. Whenever we approach researchers or journalists on the panels on Atlantic Councils, we're usually being turned down for a variety of reasons. Some of the panelists cite that they might go back to Iran, they have relatives in Iran, or one of them directly told me that my interview with the US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, was not well received inside the country. My question is that how can the journalists, researchers, independent thinkers in the United States help organizations, small organizations like us, to stay independent and cover both sides of the aisle? Thank you.
May we get another one?
Sure, let's get another one. And then there's another one in the back, and then we'll come to the front after.
Good morning, my name is Majid Fani. I'm Iranian American. As I studied the mission of your center, which says explain this information where and when it occurs, I asked Emerson and Suzanne to provide a balanced view about this propaganda machine. I wonder how you explain the counter affairs of same issue with the US government when we see people like Pompeo says we were taught to tell lies and cheat and deceive, and then now he is foreign minister, and when he sees, for example, 20 Iraqis are celebrating killing of Qasem Soleimani, and the next day we see tens of thousands, if not millions, are demonstrating in Iraq and Iran. So does it serve good information or misinformation when we just present a one-sided view of these things? Like Trump is coming and saying, okay, we have records that Qasem Soleimani was planning to attack number of embassies. And when he's asked, he says 4 embassies. And next day, when Secretary of Defense was asked about this information, he says, well, I don't have any clue. And we see same thing in Bush time when he was talking about weapons of mass destructions. Unfortunately, people in the CIA gave a report to Colin Powell that he later on apologized for what he presented in the United States. So I don't want to repeat all these kind of things, but my question is, what kind of responsible reporting or analysis is this, and what message this sends from US to the whole world, the Iranians as well, that if we see a balanced view presented to help peace and understanding, mutual and healthy interaction, not a kind of one-sided misinformation which we know that there are centers who are paid
Yeah.
for
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
creating this
so-
kind of behavior. And lastly, for example, the Iran International that our friends mentioned is supported by
So-
Saudi princes.
So one question is about countering Iranian disinformation or influence operations, and the other is supporting journalists who are on the receiving end of it.
Well, as a journalist, I think it's important to support our fellow journalists. A lot of my colleagues have also been harassed, their families have been harassed, and we always stand in support of journalists who are doing their jobs and call on every government to allow the free press to do the service that it's supposed to do for the world. On that note, on the second question, well, I mean, this was one study about specifically Iranian digital influence operations. We could pretty much do this for every country in the world. And I'm sure it'd be really interesting. Maybe we will.
And I'll wrap us up. So those
We
two
have
questions.
Until 11, by the way.
Oh, not 10:30?
No, the good news is
Oh.
that we have until 11.
Pardon me, I will not wrap us up. But I think those two questions are really representative of two very different perspectives in this information conflict that we've tried to study and characterize in objective of a fashion as possible. Because if you look at why Iran has developed these capabilities and why Iran acts in the manner it has, and it does, it's because they would say that they are on the losing side of an information battle, that they have been barred from the global media environment, that their normal branded broadcasts cannot get out, and that they are actually assailed by a range of other information actors, to include the United States, to include Saudi and Gulf media, and to include a very effective Iranian opposition movement that has its own, we've used this word a lot, but its own very sophisticated media apparatus. And I don't want to put my finger on the scale in either direction except to make the argument that when we talk about U.S. policy, and as we think about things moving forward, I want to make the argument for candor. The fact that the United States is in a position not to put a spin on things, not to order that the U.S. Global Agency for Media engage in, quote, counter-influence activities. We have the power and the opportunity to tell things straight, both regarding U.S. actions in the region, but then also regarding the horrific things that Iran has recently done against its own people and been able to cover up because of growing Iranian internet capabilities. That's how I characterize what U.S. should do moving forward.
You have more questions here.
Thank you very much. What is the preferred access of Iranian information operations in Iraq with its surrogates in Iraq, or people who are the protest people who are against Iranian, presumably against Iranian influence in Iraq? How does Iran operate media-wise in Iraq?
Well, from what I've seen from just my reporting, a journalist perspective, is that it doesn't seem to be that there's particular, like that they tailor necessarily to by country. So, I mean, Twitter, Facebook, Telegram, those are all very popular.
Yeah. Out of the data sets we were able to review, there wasn't that much that seemed to specifically target Iraqi audiences. It's my suspicion that you don't need this sort of social media manipulation apparatus if you're trying to reach Iraq, because you have so many other agents of influence that can do a better job. In fact, as a general rule, when you talk about why states develop this kind of social media manipulation stuff, it's when they're trying to reach audiences that they can't do through other methods. If you have a range of proxies and a ton of money that you can shower on the region, you don't need to run botnets and sock puppets in the same way. That said, just because I thought of it and because it's interesting, Facebook did last year do a takedown of a social media influence network in Iraq that seemed to be spreading mostly revisionism regarding Saddam Hussein and the Ba'athist Party, painting it in a much more positive light. That is a strange and interesting thread that I think someone needs to pull as you consider the states that might have an interest in running that sort of apparatus.
There's one more in the front. Two more.
Did you find any evidence of collaboration between Iranian and Russian influence efforts when it came to Syria specifically?
So the thing there is to draw the distinction between coordination and complementary messaging. What's interesting is if you look at the history of the attributions we've made to these different Iranian influence networks, for a long time, before Facebook and Twitter began releasing affirmative data sets, researchers would find messages that were linked to Iran, but think that they originated with Russia. Because back in 2016, everyone was looking for Russian propaganda activity online. And a lot of Iranian stuff was actually scooped up as a result. Now we have a much fuller picture of how these capabilities developed. One suspects that there was some coordination between Iran and Russia in building these influence capabilities, especially after 2014, when Russia had even more reason to invest in it following the Euromaidan movement in Ukraine and their occupation of Crimea. All that being said, there's not so much evidence of real coordination. And also, when you think about it, there doesn't often need to be coordination. It's very cheap to run these sock puppet and influence networks and to just keep writing stories and throwing things at a wall and seeing what sticks. You don't necessarily need to, have two state actors having regular conversations about messaging.
Can you explain sock puppet?
Oh, sure. And for the audience, when we talk about a sock puppet, we talk about a social media account that purports to be somebody else than who they really are. And we see often sock puppets that may have I'm going to try using the word sophisticated, sock puppets that have long histories that have been seeded and designed so that particular online persona does not draw suspicion and is then seen to be an authentic messenger in a way that would not occur if the real identity of that messenger was known.
So it's not in the influence operations necessarily, but in my reporting, I have seen coordination and more so in training between the Russians and the Iranians, more so the Russians of the Iranians in terms of hacking and in the cyberspace. So, one could pull that thread and kind of find conclusions, but it wasn't something that was necessarily part of our study.
Hi, my name is Pantaya Modiri. I'm a journalist, very new in DC. I'm relocated from Europe recently for Iran International TV. Suzanne, you mentioned earlier that the rulers in Iran, they want their Persian Empire back. But I'm questioning that. Do they want the Persian Empire back, or do they want to have an Islamic empire, or to be more specific, a Shiite Islamic empire?
Well, that's kind of, I touched a bit on this about the sort of identity crisis almost, the paradoxical nature of the nation, in the sense that, there is this Persian patriotism at the core, but there's a Islamic Republic, a Shia kind of veneer. So I guess in short, the way I would answer your question is they want the kind of dominance of the Persian Empire under the Shia flag, and that their sphere of influence that they're looking to spread through these information operations and this information warfare is precisely in order to create that kind of Shia kingdom, so to speak.
And I'll just add, when you're examining Iranian networks of influence, what's really interesting is you can look at the the territories that were controlled at the peak of the Iranian Empire in like the 1600s, and you can kind of tell the states that Iran still has an interest in through that lens.
Mm-hmm.
But you can also look at it through the Shiism perspective, and that explains other nations that Iran really focuses on. I mentioned the disproportionate focus on Nigeria. It's because Nigeria's population is, I think, about 40% Muslim, but they also have a very active Shia community, which is frequently seen to be under pressure from the Nigerian government. And the Iranian messaging is very much trying to reach that small community. So if you can't explain it through one lens, you can really explain it through another. And it's interesting to apply the two, which really tells you the more holistic picture of how this messaging apparatus operates and who they're trying to reach.
But they're also active in Indonesia as well because of the large Muslim population in Indonesia. So yes, I mean, you're absolutely right to bring up that point and to make that distinction. So thank you.
Let's take a few more in the back, and then we'll come back to the front. Gentleman over there.
Hi. So I wanted to pick up on a point that Emerson had made that Iran, I think this is salient because they do not really have the resources or the credibility to stand up any sort of news channel to propagate, a legitimate news channel to propagate out their views that would get very far. We do, at the same time, have allies and partners in the region who are quite wealthy, who, not at the same scale, are engaging in similar forms of using networks of social media bots to prop up certain messaging favorable to their governments, even while they do have state-run and state-owned media channels with a pro, whether it's Saudi, Qatari line of reporting. Do you think, or how much pressure do you think we need to put on our allies and partners, or do you think it's necessary for us to sort of get our own house in order before we're able to meaningfully engage in a dialogue with Iran about ceasing this kind of activity?
Well, dialogue with Iran, I think, is problem number one. Yes, so Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Israel, were part of our study, who had also participated in similar kinds of influence operations. But in terms of, I think it's a tough question in the sense that it's sort of like the question we had earlier, where it's a matter of what is nefarious. So how does the US government have a conversation about these sort of information operations when the question of what is nefarious is kind of at the crux of it? I mean, Iran sees this as their modus operandi as how they're conducting public diplomacy, the same way Secretary Pompeo sees his speeches and his activities as how he's conducting foreign policy and public diplomacy. When the spokesperson Morgan Ortagus goes on various news channels, she is conducting public diplomacy. So, it's a tricky question.
Yeah. So I was thinking of two examples that kind of illustrate the phenomenon you were talking about. The first was when you look at the sorts of stories that these Iranian influence networks emphasize, there's a lot regarding the war in Yemen. The highlighting of real atrocity, but then also the invention or recasting or mischaracterization of events to make them seem even more horrific than the horrible events that are unfolding. As a big Iranian focus, specifically to target Saudi Arabia. At the same time, we now have a few data sets of Saudi influence operations, and we know that they've created a number of fake accounts that claim to be run by Iranian democratic dissidents, which in turn invent brutalities conducted by the Iranian government that may not actually be real. these two efforts kind of cancel each other out in a way. And you could even argue this is just the latest evolution of an information conflict that's been running for centuries. I don't think it's good, but I'm not sure, as you consider U.S. priorities, even in its influence operations realm, if that should be something we should address first, when there's so many other more pressing concerns for the U.S. public.
One more in the back, and we'll come back to the front.
Hi, Grace Elliott from the National Democratic Institute. I wanted to get back to your point about the effectiveness of Iranian influence campaigns in the U.S. specifically. After Soleimani's killing, there was reporting that came out of Iran about large-scale protests and mournings around his death. And at least from the DC perspective, it seems like most of those were taken at face value. But then if you spoke to members of the diaspora community, they were more likely to say that these reports were exaggerated or hyperbolized somewhat. And if this is the case, does it speak to the effectiveness of at least news reporting coming out of Iran if in DC-centric circles we're more likely to take reporting at face value if it comes from Iran versus from Russia or North Korea or other closed countries?
Well, good thing there's a whole panel about this next. So stay tuned. The Qasem Soleimani killing or assassination, that in of itself just goes to show like how polarized that news incident was. So I'm going to answer your question with like both sides of this. Yes, there were mourners in the streets mourning Qasem Soleimani. Yes, there were people in the streets protesting and saying death to the dictator, and meaning the supreme leader. So to take reporting at face value is never a good idea. And in terms of whether or not Iranian influence operations, that is an example of it being effective. Again, I think that depends on who you're talking to, but I will say that the kind of charm offensive, which is what sort of the Gulf diplomats would say if you were speaking to them about this, because they see Foreign Minister Zarif's kind of media blitz in, and I know I keep bringing this up, but it's because it's kind of, it's important. It was a big part of their sort of push, their public diplomacy push. Foreign Minister Zarif did do lots of interviews and hold lots of kind of meetings and whatnot to try and win the hearts and minds of, or at least curry some sort of favor with, and if not curry some sort of favor, to at least get their perspective in front of journalists and policy people and people who then turn around and give the analysis and give the reporting in DC when a big event like Qasem Soleimani's killing / assassination happened. So long answer to your question is that, yeah, maybe that is an example of how Iranian influence operations were maybe playing out in terms of how what perspectives we saw when that massive news event took place.
And I'll add, unfortunately, the Iranian dispatches were given so much providence and weighted with credibility because the U.S. government had lost credibility. Because this was becoming clear even contemporaneously. Senior U.S. officials had engaged in falsehood and prevarication regarding the rationale behind that strike. And more broadly, because U.S. government and communications apparatuses have said things publicly that are not true. If you are concerned about influence operations and public messaging in the world, your number one asset is your credibility. Mm-hmm. And that credibility, unfortunately, has been eroded over the last few years.
Mm-hmm. Also, it really doesn't help the U.S. government to not have regular press briefings. I mean, I'm not just saying that because I'm a journalist and I'd like to have press briefings. I just think taking my journalist hat off. It doesn't help your country's messaging if you're not having regular press briefings because, frankly, tell your story before somebody else can.
The gentleman in the front, can we get a mic? Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Hassan. I was born in Tehran, and I'm a Muslim. As I listen to the questions and the comments, I find a very common thread that what is happening in Islamic Iran, the Republic of Iran, Islamic Republic of Iran, for some reason, some people in the world or some group have not yet come to understand and accept the reality that this movement is not going away. Not now, not in future. It's going to go till to accomplish the goal that they have set for themselves. Now, there was an assassination that took out a very beloved General Soleimani from the nation of Iran. Now, I've heard one person saying killing, you said killing, the questioner said killing, you said killing, then you corrected yourself by using the right word of assassination. There was an assassination was done. Now, this will set a precedent in the world for other governments to do exactly what we did under Mr. Trump's directions of taking out another government's general in another country. So it is your duty, and your obligation to the public. When you compare the people mourning Soleimani and few people saying death to the dictator, putting them in the same level, you need to think again. And so I appreciate Atlantic Council. I come here only once in a while, and then I come here just to share with you, my feelings, because now I live in America, but I was born in Tehran. I look for the good fortunes of America because my kids, my grandchildren, and everybody is living here. But the way that people who are in media are behaving is not helping the situation. And there's many, many, many other examples, like when they attacked the base in Iraq, American base, Mr. Trump says some of our people had headaches. Yeah. Read the news again.
Yeah.
Thank
you for your comment.
So I'd like to start. I'll start.
And if you want to include your closing remarks.
Sure.
We have only 5 minutes left.
Sure. I would characterize that strike against Soleimani as an assassination because we weren't in a state of warfare. But I also want to make clear that Qasem Soleimani was responsible at least for the deaths of 700 U.S. service members. I was very briefly a journalist, and the most affecting story I filed was an interview with a family in Georgia whose son, a U.S. Army captain, had been killed by an explosive ordnance penetrator in Iraq in 2007. There's plenty of blame to go around everywhere. What I want to accomplish, and what I hope this report helps accomplish, is to pull back the perspective a little bit and to approach in an objective way and without too much bias the exact sorts of operations that go on in this region and why they go on. To speak more broadly to U.S. foreign policy moving forward, a thing I want is peace, and for people to not die the way that Army captain did, to not die the way the 1,500 Iranians killed in November and December had died, nor the way that the hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and Syrian civilians have died in the course of conflict that has consumed the region for 2 decades.
But if you ask the question...
No, sir. Thank you.
Sorry, we need to move on and wrap up this conversation. Thank you. Sorry, I will encourage you to continue the conversation after the panel.
So, as the reason why I felt very strongly about working with Emerson as a journalist on this report is because I was hoping to foster some sort of understanding, which is the kind of pathway to peace. Is if we understand each other, maybe there's more of a hope for peace. And it's very difficult to follow in Emerson's very heartfelt closing remarks, but I hope that this report is the beginning of kind of, like I said, an understanding in terms of how Iran is projecting itself, and perhaps the beginning of a more broader conversation.
Thank you. This has been a great and insightful conversation. I encourage everyone to read and download and share the report. It's available on the Atlantic Council's website. There are hard copies around as well. Grab one. Thank you again for joining us this morning. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If everybody could take a seat, and for those of the folks that are outside, if they could come on back in, we're going to get started here in the next 30 seconds with a fireside chat with Will Wechsler, my colleague Will Wechsler, who runs our Middle East programs, as well as Congressman Hurd, who just walked into the building. So we'll get started here momentarily. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope everyone enjoyed the first panel. I know that I did. My name is William Wechsler. I lead the Middle East work here at the Atlantic Council. And we are honored to have at the midpoint of this day of talking about Iran, Representative Will Hurd from Texas. Representative Hurd is critical to this conversation for two reasons. First, on Capitol Hill, he's on the Intelligence Committee, he's on the Appropriations Committee. This is a man who spends a lot of his time every day looking at some of these issues that we are discussing previously and will continue to discuss from those institutional perspectives, but then also from his personal perspective. He was with the, before being elected to Congress in 2015, he spent 9.5 years in the CIA. He spent time during that in and around Iran, in Afghanistan, in India, in Pakistan, in Yemen, and elsewhere. He's one of the real substantive thinkers on Capitol Hill.
Bar is low.
About not just what just what the policies are, but how the policies really get implemented on a day-to-day basis. And so we're very, very proud to have him here. Unfortunately, we only have him for a relatively short period of time, so I'm going to dive right into the questions. This is going to be a fireside chat between the two of us before he has a very hard stop in about 23 minutes. Given his responsibilities on the Hill. But first, let me just start. We just had a really good conversation about Iranian information operations. Can you please help us by putting those operations in context of Iran's wider asymmetric strategies that they employ?
Sure. And first, it's always a pleasure to be here with y'all. And I think what y'all are doing here in talking about and trying to deal with disinformation is important in getting folks from all levels of society to have this conversation. This is the only way that we're gonna be able to deal with it. And when you know, because I'm a former professional intelligence officer, I look through these issues from that mindset. And so I always start with covert action, right? You know, disinformation is a subsection of covert action. And why are you involved in covert action, right? And it depends. And when you look at what the Iranians are trying to do in their sphere of influence, they have different strategic objectives in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Yemen. They have different elements and entities that they use to achieve those strategic objectives, and then trying to manage the information domain. They have different issues tactically. But then when you look at what do they do from a strategic level, something as basic, and what I would say is I've criticized many of my colleagues and some folks in the media about painting Iran as a victim. That in the latest things that have happened, they are a victim. They are a victim because our president pulled out of the JCPOA, and the Iranians have done, I think, a very good job of kind of dominating that narrative, even though they have lied to and misled the international community for 40 freaking years, right? They have lied to and misled the IAEA, and so it's you got to look at their covert action on those tactical levels, on how it supports them on the battlefield, but also how they position themselves in a broader geopolitical world, and we have to be sensitive of that, right? I have a friend, Iranian American, left after the fall of Iran, leading nephrologist. He told me, he goes, Will, in all your interviews, stop saying Iran. Say the Iranian government, because your beef is with the Iranian government. It's not with the Iranian people. And I'm like, yeah, look, that's, being precise on this and trying to articulate how we try to counter that is important too. So now I always say Iranian government and separate that from the Iranian people or the broader Persian culture. And so it is, they know that this is an area that they have to dominate in, and they're pretty sophisticated. I would say if the Russians are probably the best in the world when it comes to disinformation and that level of covert action, I would say Iran is probably a very close second.
I think your point about dividing the Iranian government, so making sure that we're separating the Iranian government and the Iranian people is a very important one, because always in my time in government, the strongest element of U.S. Policy, our greatest comparative advantage, was the fact that the Iranian people in general don't like their government.
Yep.
And so what was important then was to make sure that none of our actions brought the Iranian people and their government closer together, because we didn't want to put that comparative advantage at risk. With that saying, right now we're in a situation, we have been for some time, ever since Iran shot down a commercial airliner, where there's a lot of disturbance domestically. There are a lot of protests, there's a lot of, is there any role for the United States in that context, in that discussion?
Absolutely. The United States should support freedom-loving people everywhere, right? And the way we do that is, how do you amplify their voices, right? Ultimately, what is the longer goal in Iran? I don't believe that the Iranian government is going to change its ways, right? They believe that they need to have a nuclear weapon because that's going to allow them to negotiate in a different way in that region. They are going to continue to use proxies to push forward their agenda, and they are trying to hold on to power, right? So the only way, but also it's regime change. We know we haven't had a very good track record on that. And so how do you support the Iranian people to get what they want, right? Which is freedom. And how do you strengthen institutions for them? Right? One of the areas, I think the organizations that I've been told that have some level of leadership structures are actually the unions, right? And so how do we work and strengthen those as a potential alternative of power? How do we amplify through technical and digital means the people that are criticizing the government? The reporters that signed off and said, "I'm sorry, I've been lying to you for 15 years or whatever." What are we doing to make sure that voice keeps getting reported back into Iran, and then also to the Iranian diaspora? And guess what? No matter what happens, the Iranian government is going to say everything that's happening is because of the CIA. It's in their best interest to do that, to create this boogeyman, right, and to say anything bad is some outside forces. They are already going to say that, and that should not be a deterrent for making sure that we have public and open support to the Iranian people. And I would like to know, what does the Iranian people want us? How do they want us to amplify their message? And if you look at what's happening in Hong Kong, right, I love that the protesters in Hong Kong are saying, hey, we want y'all to do this, say this, support us here, right? Great. Check, we'll do it, right? We're in. And so yes, there is a role. What that role looks like, what part of the government, depends, but showing broader support and making sure we're amplifying those messages. And one of the things I've been frustrated with, I got into a little tiff with a journalist who had a conversation with the Iranian foreign minister. And I was questioned because I said, to me, if the Iranian government wants to become part of the world community again, it's real simple. Stop killing Americans. Don't kill our allies. Stop lying about your nuclear weapons. Don't kill your own people when they protest, right? That's it. That's all we're asking. And I used the point about how they killed 1,500 people, right, during the recent protests. And that was a Reuters number. And Reuters had talked to 3 Iranian Ministry of Interior folks. And then I got pushed back. That's a fake number. It's a Trump number, I think is what actually was said. And I said, well, did you ask the Iranian foreign minister why he killed, how many people they killed? Well, we didn't have time. Okay, well, when we have the opportunity to have Iranian officials in front of a Western media outlet, do not let them spread their talking points, right? That is an attempt of misinformation, right? And so we can't let that go away. Now, it's not my responsibility to tell a journalist what question they should or shouldn't ask, right? I think it's important to have a free and fair election. That's why what y'all are doing is important, to have some of these broader conversations. Again, I'm sorry I went off on a tangent.
No, not a problem.
I don't even remember what the original question was. Sorry.
Let me ask you, put on your analytic hat for a moment, and what do you, given what you know about Iran, what do you expect them to do next? And let me posit something here. You know, the Trump administration, I think it's fair to say, at least in my view, that has successfully reinforced a red line with its strike against Soleimani. But it's a red line that they've drawn. And that red line is don't kill another American. And it's unclear or not thus far whether or not Iran will still continue to be on one side of that red line, but that red line is fairly clear. But there are a lot of other potential red lines in U.S. policy that have been around for quite a long time, since the Carter Doctrine and so forth, about the security of the Gulf, about we have interests in Iran, we have interests on the nuclear issue. What would you expect they would do next?
So the short answer is, I don't know. Right. The longer answer is, the Army War College did a review of Iranian operations within Iraq from, I believe it was 2008 to 2017. I think was the time period. And some of those reviews was that when the Iranian government suffered consequences to their behavior, they stopped that behavior, right? Which is, you know, I think the Qasem Soleimani strike and their response to that was an example of that. I think you're going to see a pause, but they're going to go back to what they're used to doing. They're going to be using proxies to increase pressure. They are going to evaluate broader strategic, opportunities, what those opportunities in the Gulf may be. I think the miscalculation they made is the United States government can't do this alone. We have to have our European allies supporting us. We have to make sure that we're in lockstep with the Germans, the British, and the French, right? And I think that's where the conversations need to go, because whatever the next response to Iranian malign behavior, there needs to be a global response to it, not just a U.S. response. And so my answer to whatever they do next is be prepared for that with a global response. But we know they're going to continue to try to push on their nuclear weapons development. We know that they're going to continue to spread, to support proxies, around the world. We know that they're going to do those kinds of things. Are we going to see an escalation of cyber attacks? Likely. It's when you see a list of all the kind of just significant cyber attacks since I think 2004. The list is pretty long. So I think they're going to use some level in all three of those areas.
I think the point you made is exactly right about the need to make sure that it's not a U.S.-Iran confrontation, but it's an Iran versus the rest of the world, confrontation. That's when we're at our strongest point.
When the Iranians came to the table at the beginnings of the negotiation on JCPOA, why did they come to the table? Because there was an international international coalition that had gotten them there, right? And so that kind of coalition, we should be increasing and strengthening our alliances, not weakening them. And when it comes to this threat, it's even more important.
And how would you characterize the Trump administration's efforts along these lines? I mean, the way that they've approached the maximum pressure campaign has been intentionally unilateral instead of multilateral. The way they've approached the Gulf security, there's been some attempts to involve a coalition of the willing to do this, but our European allies have decidedly said that they do not want to be part of, in some respects, of an American-led effort. So, how would you characterize this?
Sure, and this is, there's always going to be debate around this, and I would say that Iranian behavior has escalated. Now, others would say, well, that's because the United States pulled out of the JCPOA, and my opinion on the JCPOA is the Iranian nuclear program is only one element of the broader Iranian activity that needs to be addressed, right? And so whether that as itself could be a starting point in order to deal with the Iranian nuclear program is not the debate, in my opinion. It's how do you deal with these other elements of their traditional military programs and weapons programs, their support to terrorist organizations, right? Like how do you curtail all of those kinds of activities? Now, some would say, is maximum pressure bringing about the desired reaction? If the desired reaction is to have a conversation to try to get them to curtail the nuclear program, but you've seen an increase in their threats and targeting our resources, some would say that hasn't been successful. But I would say is this was what you're going to expect the Iranians to do before they get to that point where they're actually proverbially on their knees and having to come negotiate because the economic sanctions are too difficult. I don't think maximum pressure is going to ultimately get the Iranians to the bargaining table unless we get our European allies involved, right? And I think the tightening of this and forcing the Iranians to feel that pressure, I think that strategy is something we should pursue, but it'll be even more effective if we had our European allies.
Do you think there's been clarity about the objective of the maximum pressure campaign? I mean, whether it's about restarting negotiations on better terms, or whether it's about regime change, or whether it's about just raising the price for malign behavior. Do you think that there's been clarity about that in Pompeo's list of demands on other statements that the Trump administration, or is there any confusion potentially along those lines?
Well, I think there's confusion. There's no question about that. But I can't say that I've inspected all of Secretary Pompeo's statements and whether he said things that are clear. I would say that I don't know if the end goal of maximum pressure was articulated at the beginning of the use of that term, right? And I would probably say from my perspective that the end goal has been clarified or attempted to be clarified over the existence of the maximum pressure campaign. But I think most folks within the administration, and I think this isn't a bipartisan accepted fact, nobody wants World War III with the Iranian government, right? Like nobody wants that. Now, some believe that some of these efforts are going to lead to that. Others believe it won't, right? There's a debate on that, but I don't think anybody wants to get to that point. And so I would say that I think the lack of clarity at the beginning has caused some confusion, but I think they have made it clear now that the end goal is to get the Iranians to ultimately negotiate.
Do you think there's any possibility of that before our election, or the Iranians are just going to sit this out?
I don't think the Iranians are interested in that. The Iranian government, excuse me, is going to do that before now in November.
Excellent. We only have a little bit of time left, but I want to go back to the report and the discussion before we started this nice conversation. One of the things that came up a few times, which I thought was pretty useful and is in our report's recommendation, is that one of the challenges that we face is getting information out there about our adversaries abroad's manipulation of the information environment, whether it's the way that the Russians do it to create chaos, or whether it's what Iran does predominantly, which is to push its narrative. There was one instance where the DNI came right out and said, Russia did this. But other than that, the identification of such efforts are being really left to private companies, think tanks like ourselves. And there's a call in there for whether it's the DNI or perhaps for DHS to play a more significant role of this. Is this something that you guys on Capitol Hill are really thinking about?
They have, and some of these conversations came up with, in the debates around CISA, and I think Department of Homeland Security broadly, and starting back with Jay Johnson, when it came to countering violent extremism, they've played a critical role, and CVE is the same tactics, techniques, and procedures to deal with violent extremism, and countering it is the same that you can use in disinformation, depending on whatever the focus is. And DHS has to play a role, and I would say DHS is more important to play the lead role than DNI or anybody else within the intelligence community because of a simple fact. Need to know versus need to share, right? The intelligence communities are built on need to know. That is ingrained in the culture, that is ingrained in operations. And so when it comes to disinformation and the need to push info out, DHS is the only entity that I think is equipped to do that and can have the culture to ultimately do that. And I think what we need to see the federal government doing with DHS playing a lead is when you see these examples to say, this is what happened, this is what we know, and get that information out. And all the objections and what should happen, it should let civil society make some of those conversations, but provide that, this is how we found, this is what they've done, this is the elements of the Iranian government that are doing this, this is the tools that they're using, here are the TTPs, right, and promoting those kinds of things. And it requires a mind shift within the intelligence community, because we think of the tactics, techniques, and procedures that are used in information operations as the same, similarly to what we do with conventional warfare. But once a digital tool is out in the ether, anybody can use it, right? It takes a long time to respond to a Generation 5 aircraft, right? But when it comes to information operations, it doesn't. So the declassification of information operations should move along a lot faster, because again, it's not going to be the government that ultimately counters that information. It's going to be other elements of society, and getting those basic facts out is important. And again, I think DHS is the only entity culturally that is designed to do this, and they're trying to do this within the cybersecurity space, like hardcore cyber of breaches. So you can, they have the muscle movement, it's improved. They got a long way to go, but they're doing a good job. And again, I think a lot of this started under the leadership of Jay Johnson, and I know Chris Krebs now at DHS is pushing some of this stuff as well.
Well, that's excellent. We have some ideas here at the Atlantic Council. My colleague Tom Warwick, that I see in the audience, who is at DHS for the last dozen years, heading up counterterrorism. So we'd love to share with you some of the things that we think Congress can do to help push this forward.
Awesome. I'm open.
Excellent. Well, with that, again, apologize everyone for the short time, but Congress forces a demanding schedule. So I really appreciate this this conversation.
More earlier time for lunch, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, make sure.
Everybody come in? Can you get everybody in? Yeah. Okay, I think we're gonna get started. There's still some people loitering outside, but we wanna start this panel in a timely fashion. I'm Barbara Slavin. I direct the Future of Iran initiative here at the Atlantic Council. I hope a lot of you were here for the morning session, which I think was really interesting in terms of looking at how Iran projects its influence through information, through social media. The topic of this panel is how journalists, particularly journalists who cannot go to Iran, who used to go to Iran perhaps, but for various reasons can't go back, try to piece together information about what is actually happening in this country. And it strikes me that we're swimming in a sea of disinformation these days, coming at us from a variety of sources. Some of them are coming from governments, including our own, and we'll talk about that. Members of Congress, Congressman Hurd said Iran had a nuclear weapons program, which the last time I checked, they did not, according to our own CIA. So perhaps he knows something that we don't know. We have information efforts, as I mentioned, by the U.S. government that sometimes are lacking in credibility. I think that for journalists, our real journalists, our mandate is to find the truth, present the truth. But the real question is, how can governments, including our own, formulate policy if it's not based on solid information, if it's not based on facts? And this is particularly a problem, I think, when we deal with so-called rogue states like Iran or North Korea, states that control information in the way that they do. So that's my little editorial. I'm going to introduce our moderator, who will then introduce the rest of our wonderful panel. We are really lucky. We have the creme de la creme of Iranian American journalists to join us on this panel. Our moderator is Asiya Namdar. She's an anchor for CGTN America in Washington, D.C., but she has long experience before that working for CNN International. She has written and reported on many international stories, not just Iran, but I got to know her as a moderator of interviews and panels on Iran for China Global Television. So Asiya, without further ado, let me have you come up, have everybody else come up, and we'll begin this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, for that very generous introduction. I hate hearing anything about myself. It's never easy. Let me introduce our very distinguished panel. Really, these incredible journalists do not need introduction, but I will do a short little blurb on each one of them. We have Farnaz Fasihi, who's joining us via Skype. Is she going to be on the screen soon? Hopefully you'll get to see her. She's a writer and political journalist. Hi, Farnaz June. Can you hear me?
Good. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Nice to see you. So I can't think of anyone who knows and writes more about Iran. Probably her and Jason in front of me. And anytime I want to get information where I work, the first person I check with is tweets of Jason's and Farnaz. So glad you can both be here. So Farnaz writes about Iran for the New York Times. Previously, she was a senior writer for the Wall Street Journal for 17 years, based in the Middle East. She's done a number of things. You guys probably can read the bios on your journal, because I want to move this thing quickly so we can get to asking questions, so you all can ask questions as well. We have Nazila Fatih, who I've known for many years. She's an author and former Tehran correspondent for the New York Times. And she has done something a little bit different lately. She's written 2 children's books that we were talking about before we got here. One is called My Name is Siruz, and the other one is called Avicenna, the Father of Modern Medicine. We have my other friend here. I'm lucky all my friends are here. Jason Rezaian, global opinion writer for the Washington Post. You all know Jason because of his 544 days in Evin prison behind bars on ridiculous, bogus charges. And he's also written a book that I've read, My 544 Days in an Iranian Prison. If you have not read it, please do. It's a fascinating book about hope, resilience, courage, family, and love. And finally, we all know Barbara Slavin, Future of Iran Initiative, Atlantic Council. She is probably one of our favorite guests on the program that I broadcast down the street. And she's one of my favorite people. She's a director of Future of Iran Initiative, as I mentioned, at the Atlantic Council, adjunct professor at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. And I think for all our panelists here, I'm the only one who has not written a book. Every single one of these incredible panelists has written a book. So let me welcome you all so we can get started and get to the point of what we want to talk about. Wish I could see.
Oh, it's great. We can see Farnessa.
Oh, yeah, she's right there.
She's right there.
All right. Hello.
Farnose, you can hear me, right?
Yes, I can. Hello, my friends.
Hello to you. Let me begin with you and the piece that you wrote in the New York Times recently with the basically chronicling the events that happened with the crash of that Ukrainian jetliner that left 176 people dead following its crash. Can you walk us through how you got your information? It was so remarkable and detailed. I want to know how that happens and what the process is for you to get that published and how long it took.
I think for every Iranian, no matter where they were, the shooting down of the passenger plane, Ukrainian airline, was very traumatic. It was a collective trauma, like one that I don't remember for a very long time, because all of us could see ourselves, our family members, our loved ones in those passengers, basically innocent people who boarded a plane to go home and were shot down. It was a tragedy. And as I was following the story on a daily news basis and trying to piece it together, and the story kept revealing itself from with a technical error to 3 days later, the government or the Revolutionary Guards admitting that they had shot down the plane. For me, the question was, how could this happen? Who knew what? When did they know it? Basically, the questions, the basic questions of journalism: who, when, what, where, who knew, what were the decision makers, and how did that happen? And I began by first very meticulously documenting every comment from officials, from transcribing every comment, every interview, every press conference by Revolutionary Guards commanders in the parliament, writing down all the comments from officials to see the trajectory of how they had addressed this. And then I reached out to my sources. I think when Barbara was doing the introduction, she mentioned how challenging it is for us to really try to figure out what's happening in Iran and try to document it. I think for reporters working from afar, the only way that can be done is if you've actually worked in Iran, if you have many years of following this story, if you speak Farsi, and if you've built up sources. I would have never been able to do this piece if I had not covered Iran for 25 years and had a wide network of sources from the military, from the guards, from the government, analysts, opposition, who were willing to share information with me. So that's how it happened. And then as I was in the process of trying to put this together, we thought the best way to address this best way to present this to readers was to just do a simple diary form, day by day, of laying out what officials had said and what our sources had said next to one another, and do a reconstruction of what we called was anatomy of a lie. And as you know, I mean, for me, the incredible thing in reporting that was not only that President Rouhani claimed he did not know, was how could a president not know? And if the president of a country is kept in the dark about something as enormous as shooting down a civilian plane and killing 179 people, what kind of a legitimacy does this president have? What kind of a legitimacy does this government have? And who really is in control of Iran? And this was the idea behind the piece in trying to really show that the guards control Iran, and if President Rouhani and his government did not know, that doesn't exonerate them from this crime. That actually puts in question what kind of power they have and whether they can really be viewed as people that the international community can deal with.
I have a question for all of you, actually, but let me begin with Jason, and then you guys, I would love for you to get your feedback as well. How do we gauge real, factual information versus garbage and disinformation? How do you dissect it?
Well,
how do you know what's true and what's not?
I think that's a great question, and one that Farnaz's reporting shows is still possible. And those of us who worked in Iran know that you always have to parse what the official line on any issue is with your lived experience. So for those of us who continue to write about it from afar, we have to maintain those kinds of contacts that Farnaz alluded to. Unfortunately, given my experience in Iran, there are not a lot of Iranian officials ready to take my calls.
You don't want to take their calls anyway.
No. For the record, I haven't tried to call any of them directly. But I do have a lot of sources that are people that I trust that work in a variety of different industries, journalists who continue to work even though the space around journalism is closing quickly and dramatically. And now in my capacity as an opinion writer, I'm no longer reporting as a news correspondent, right? And I think it's an important point to make. That being said, because it's my name on it, I go through extra hoops and extra layers of verification before I'm willing to put anything in print. So there's some stories that I've sat on for a very long time and not even published because I just wasn't sure, I couldn't be sure if all of my reporting was 100% accurate.
And of course, social media has changed the dynamic so much. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. And Nazila, you talk about your experience and really, how do you dissect fact from fiction?
Well, I mean, Farnaz put it very well, and Jason said everything else. So I really don't know what to add, but the fact that we have two reporters who speak Persian, who know the country, and they are going through everything that is coming out and basically sifting through information and disinformation to find out which one is which. I think that shows how important it is for those who speak the language, those who know the history, those who know people on the ground to do this job. As Iranians, and speaking on the 41st anniversary of the revolution, I think this rings even more true because we had a revolution that was very much built upon disinformation and lies. Part of it was the lies that was spread against the Shah, the facts that were exaggerated to infuriate people, to fuel the dissent, and then the lies that the leaders told people. I mean, every time at this time, people are putting out Khomeini's video right after he came to Iran and promised to give free utilities to people. Those were all lies. So Iranian people have already gone through a catastrophic change that was based on lies, and we are living in the age of disinformation. It's not just something that is relevant to Iran. It's happening everywhere in the world. It's very relevant to our lives here in the United States. So it is much more important now for people like Farnaz and Jason to go through everything, to separate fact from fiction, and just to make reasonable conclusions, because the danger now is that the voice of reason is completely drowned.
And that brings me to my next point, Barbara. It's not just ordinary Iranians or ordinary Americans or ordinary people with disinformation. We have members of Congress, we have politicians in this country, we have world leaders and prime ministers who sometimes are not the most truthful. We had a Republican congressman sit here and tell us Iran has a nuclear program. So
a nuclear weapons
a
program.
Nuclear weapons program. So talk a little bit about that.
You know, when I think about Iran, I've been fortunate that I was able to go there, but
my trips there were of short duration. I relied a lot on people like Nazila, who I got to meet there, to give me a sense of the country. I feel lucky that I had enough of a sense that it gives me a certain way to apply the smell test to some reports that are coming out of Iran that I can tell are hyped or are exaggerated in some way or another. But I think of a comment made by someone I knew who went to North Korea, who said, all of us, all we have is snapshots. Nobody has the movie. Mm-hmm. So, we each have our own lens and the way in which we see and interpret things, depending on the people we know and our own experiences dealing with this very fascinating and complicated country. That said, we have been in a true information war between the Trump administration and Iran for the last 3 years, with the Trump administration taking an extremely hawkish and bellicose line toward Iran even before it quit the nuclear deal, and with our own government pumping out propaganda in support of its policy and also funding groups that have spent most of their time using their taxpayer dollars to attack other members of the diaspora rather than projecting a positive or factual message. So I think all we can do is try to sift through it, use the instincts that we've all developed in decades in this profession. If something doesn't ring true, if it sounds like somebody has an agenda behind it maybe, think twice, take a deep breath before you retweet it. Call people you trust. Follow the people you trust, read Farnaz, read Jason, and then come to a logical conclusion about it. I don't think it's impossible, and I think long experience helps. One of the pieces I wrote for the Atlantic Council recently was about Iranian protests. You know how every time there's a protest in Iran, some people in this town say, the sky is falling, the Iranian government is going to fall tomorrow.
This is the end.
This is it. Regime change is coming. Just, and the son of the Shah is, ready to fly back in and reinstall himself. I wrote a piece about the history of protests in Iran, drawing on a piece that you did for us, Nazila, a year ago when we had a day-long thing on the 40th anniversary of the Iranian Revolution. Context matters, history matters. And so we do the best we can. That's what we have to do.
What about, I can speak for myself, but I also know all of us here have been viciously attacked. We have been threatened. Yes. Nazila as well, not Nazila, Farnaz as well, you might have been too. Really, lies, death threats, vulgarities. If I showed you the stuff people say about me, some of it was in Persian, and I had to call some Persian friends because I'm sort of bisavad, as we say in Farsi. I came here when I was 11 years old, so my reading and writing skills are not up to par. So I turned around to these people and I said, what does this say? And they were so mortified, they wouldn't tell me what it said. And then later I found the obscenities that were thrown my way. So I just want to get your take on how we deal with stuff like that. Do we ignore it like I normally do? Do we respond? Farnaz, let me begin with you and then Jason.
Well, as you mentioned, the attacks coming from the Iranian opposition activists and diaspora, some members of them, are very disheartening. I think that in terms of reply and response, these attacks come from two directions. There's an army of bots and trolls for opposition leaders, for monarchists, for the MEK, and they just churn out vile and toxic threats. I've gotten rape threats, death threats, violent threats, and they just tweet it out. So that I feel, because they're bots and trolls, I block them, I report them to Twitter. But then you've got another very more sophisticated layer of attacks, which is an attack of disinformation, which is attacking the credibility of journalists because it doesn't fall in line with the vision of some of these activists and oppositions to either push for regime change or push for war with Iran or more sanctions with Iran. I think at the core of this is a lack of understanding of what a journalist's role is in a free democratic society, and in America particularly, where we're not partisan, where a reporter, I get criticizing, you're not fighting to overthrow this regime. That is not my job. There are opposition figures and activists fighting for that. My job as a journalist is to present all sides, talk to everybody, sift through information and disinformation, and write a story, a factual-based story. So if these opposition leaders and activists and cybersecurity experts feel that you're not pushing their political views, they then allow themselves to attack your credibility and call you a propaganda agent of the regime, an apologist for the regime. And that, to me, that's the most disturbing, because it suggests that these people are as intolerant as the regime that they want to overthrow, and don't have a real understanding of what a democratic discourse and the role of a free press is in a society.
I think it's important to point out we're all journalists. We're not activists, and we shouldn't take on the role of an activist. Well, Jason, you're a little different because you write opinion pieces for the Washington. So you can take on an opinion, whereas we have to be a little bit more subtle.
But I still don't, I'm not an activist. I don't represent any one point of view or desire.
My point was you can have opinion in your pieces.
I think to kind of address the question of what should we do, I haven't come up with an effective solution yet. But I will tell you that there was a day several months ago when my editors at the Post got official complaint letters from both the Islamic Republic's mission at the UN and the MEK's front organization. So to me, if I'm getting complaints from both of those on the same, I'm doing something right. And I'm just going to keep pushing those buttons. As far as the attacks that I get, if somebody wants to call me an apologist or a propagandist or an agent of, or agent of America or whatever.
You respond?
I don't usually respond because I have a massive platform and I believe deeply in our First Amendment rights. When it becomes libelous, though, when it's, when somebody says I'm a paid agent of the Islamic Republic or, I was a CIA spy, or these kinds of things, I report it. And I'll tell you, and I want to say this publicly, Twitter, literally, dozens of libelous tweets I've reported. Not once has it ever been accepted. On the other hand, Instagram, where a lot of Iranians take part, tens of millions of Iranians are active on Instagram. I don't know if this got discussed earlier, but there was a 30-part television episode supposedly based on me and my crimes against the Islamic Republic that aired over the summer. When that happened, there was a strong and concerted social media campaign against me, specifically on Instagram, and I got hundreds of death threats, and reported, literally hundreds of Instagram accounts. I still, every couple of days, get a notification from Instagram saying we shut this account down for violating our policies. But I had to raise that through the Washington Post to a very high level within
because I've
Instagram.
done that and
Nothing
it hasn't
happens.
worked for me. Yeah. Nazila.
Well, it is amazing that somebody who has been in prison in the Islamic Republic is facing probably worse threats here in the United States. And, I don't know what is the solution, and I am not in a position to find a solution to that. But I know that what's happening is exactly the same policy that the Islamic Republic has used, but worse. But worse in the sense that these people are just out there with thuggish behavior, with baseless accusations, and they want to intimidate reporters. And I think the only way is just to ignore them and let them know that nobody's going to respond to them. I know it's annoying. To get death threats is definitely not something that you can ignore. But if they know that somebody is responding to them, or if they feel that their threats are having an impact, they'll just become more vulgar.
Barbara was recently on a program that I hosted on my network, and one of the guests very angrily, and keep this in mind, this is live television, didn't like whatever we said and took off his mic and said some very, very, keep in mind, live TV, ugly words. He cursed, and then he came after Barbara on live TV, and my role as a
he came after me for being too critical of the Iranian government. I just want that put out
You all had
there.
to see it, so I'm jumping in, trying to calm tensions, and I basically tell this guy, you're being disrespectful, and he's like, well, I'm gonna walk off your studio. I said, okay, well, you can, but if you stay, I'll come back to you. He ended up staying, and he did apologize, but it certainly made for a lively discussion, and poor Barbara was the victim of the day. So you also get it, Barbara.
Yeah, I get it. I get it from a lot of sides. I had one person call me Ayatollah Barbie, which I think is still my favorite. Possibly because I bear no resemblance to a Barbie doll. But no, they try to intimidate you. They try, the thing is though that we have a position. I mean, one of the things I'm so annoyed about these efforts to keep Javad Zarif from coming here, I think this was raised in an earlier panel. Whenever I've had an opportunity to speak to Javad Zarif in a journalistic capacity, I've asked him really tough questions. I go after him every time about hostage taking. I go after him every time about Iran's refusal to recognize Israel's right to exist. We had a session with him, I think it's the last time he got a visa before the UN General Assembly, where he talked about Iran's vision for the region and all the countries in the region should come together. And when he lists the countries in the region, of course, he leaves out Israel, which means the whole thing is a non-starter, particularly from an American point of view. So to deny us access to the few officials we can get a hold of is to deny us an ability to present our critiques and to give them a true sense, unfiltered by everything else, of how Americans are feeling about Iranian policy. And I think that would be a terrific loss if he continues to face difficulties, say, in coming to the United States. At the same time, we have to be aware of how Iran manipulates what we do. And I had an example. I gave a talk at Princeton yesterday, and in the audience was Mr. Wong, who recently got the last American hostage freed. And he said that while he was in Evin prison, IRIB, the Iranian broadcaster, he said he would often see me on IRIB, and I can only imagine what little snippets from our Atlantic Council events or other appearances I've made that they've cut out
that would work
and
for their
pasted
benefit.
that works for their benefits. So, this is, again, the atmosphere that we're living in, and so we have to be very cognizant of what we say, what we write, and how it can be used and misused by all sides.
How much of a problem is it, the fact that, when we talk about Iran and we keep talking about the opposition, but there's really no clear opposition in Iran. There's no clear opposition leader in Iran. When you think about the future with this U.S. administration, and Nazila, I'd like to begin with you, where do you see the relationship between the U.S. and Iran going? What needs to happen? And is the current Trump administration strategy effective with the sanctions, with the maximum pressure campaign, and the rest?
Well, at the moment, I think we are at a deadlock unless there are some kind of behind-the-scene negotiations going on that we are unaware of. But I think almost all of us argued that sanctions, economic embargoes, are not going to help change the behavior of the Iranian regime, that sanctions are going to put pressure on ordinary Iranians. And if Iranians become hungrier and poorer, they will not even have the energy to come out and protest against the regime. But one thing that we know as a fact, especially for those of us who covered Iran, Farnaz and I covered a lot of protests, sometimes like months and months we would go to protests almost every week. Protest is part of Iranian political landscape. When there are street protests, they don't mean that there's going to be a revolution or the Iranian regime is on the verge of collapse. It's become a way for people to communicate with the regime. And the regime usually responds with brutality. It's not that they embrace these kinds of behaviors. But we've seen over the years, these protests, I think we can say they definitely started after the election of President Khatami in 1997, and they have occurred regularly. But we've seen that since then, the government, the regime, has responded to these protests in one way or another. It has made some kind of compromise, while that sort of a political sphere that was very suppressive have remained that way. But when you look at social and cultural aspects of life, those have changed in Iran. I mean, people who are in contact with
They have changed or they haven't changed?
They have changed.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot, yeah. I mean, you talk to people in Iran and they tell you the headscarf has become almost irrelevant. And that was one of the main pillars of the 1979 revolution. I always thought that whenever the headscarf goes away, a big layer of the Islamic Republic has disappeared because women defined what the new regime stood for. So the regime has lifted some of the restrictions. It has given space to people, but it has kept that sort of political sphere very tight and repressive. But none of these protests, even the ones in November, none of them mean regime change in Iran. And I've always believed that if the United States or European countries want to see change in the behavior of the Islamic Republic, they have to engage in dialogue. I mean, the JCPOA was an excellent start, but it went the wrong way.
Jason.
I agree. Very eloquent remarks from Nazila. One thing that I would add is that, I think that not only do sanctions and these really tough measures make people's day-to-day lives easier, it also slows down civil society's ability to engage around democratic movements, big or small. These people, the people of Iran, have a difficult time connecting to the internet. Connecting many online resources that are available to the whole world are not available to Iranians. Ways that they could organize, social media. So we have to take that into consideration. But also, I want to draw a distinction between the U.S. government and Iranian government, and talk a little bit about people-to-people contact, which I think has always been the most effective way to sort of get the snowball of change in relations rolling between countries. I mean, if you look back, I'm not a Kremlinologist or anything, but it's pretty clear that throughout the Cold War, U.S. and Russian institutions had exchange programs. They had embassies open in each other's capitals. And I defy you to explain to me how the Islamic Republic poses a bigger threat to our way of life than the Soviet Union did at the height of the Cold War.
That's right. Farnaz, and then I want to go to Barbara, and then I think we have time to open for questions. Yes. Go ahead, Farnaz.
What was the question, Asya?
Basically, the future of U.S.-Iran relations and the current strategy by the Trump administration. Maximum pressure, sanctions. Is it effective?
Well, I think there's not a clear definition of what the ultimate goal of the U.S. administration is from maximum pressure. They say that they want to bring Iran to the negotiating table in order to have a better deal. On one hand, they've laid out a number of conditions for Iran to change its behavior, to cut its missiles program, its influence in the region. And if you take those all collectively together, then Islamic Republic will not be the Islamic Republic anymore. It will be another regime. So what is the end goal here? I think if the goal is to hurt the Islamic Republic financially, that goal has been achieved. The sanctions have been very effective in creating a budget deficit for the Islamic Republic. They have slashed oil sales revenues by almost 70-80%. Iran's gone from selling more than 1 million barrels to about 300,000, 200,000 a day, and through very complicated sanctions evading measures, it can't access its revenues. But yes, the people are hurting. Yes, it's having an effect on the population. They can't get medicine. They can't get goods, inflation and all of that. But if the goal of the administration was to hurt the regime financially, I think that the sanctions have been effective in achieving that. Now, is that going to translate into bringing the Islamic Republic to the negotiating table? We haven't seen that. In fact, we've seen that in Iran, they have sort of matched the US's position on maximum pressure with a maximum pressure campaign of their own. Iran has taken a lot of provocative measures in the past year in response to the Trump administration. It has shot down a drone, it has seized British tankers, it's enabled its Shia militia proxies in the region to attack the US bases, and then it all came to a head with the assassination of General Soleimani and the attacks on the US base in Al-Assad. So if anything, these policies on both sides, taking a more maximum pressure, have led to more escalation, to more confrontation. Dialogue seems even further away now than it did a year ago.
Barbara, is dialogue even remotely possible?
You know, it seems as though Donald Trump has lost interest in Iran and he's moved on to other things. I think the U.S. policy toward Iran has been very, very much determined by domestic political considerations from the beginning. Quitting the JCPOA was a promise that Donald Trump made during the campaign. He stayed in the deal very grudgingly. When his advisors kept telling him it's in U.S. interest to stay in the deal, he fired those advisors and got new ones who told him that it was in U.S. interest to quit. It's hard to see. I try to remain hopeful. I think one area where the U.S. and Iran can still talk to each other is on prisoner swaps. We saw that Mr. Wong from Princeton was let go, and I know that there are other efforts underway to get other people released, which would be a good confidence-building measure. But if the U.S. really wants new negotiations, it should take the sanctions off Zarif. It should take the sanctions off the head of the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization, which were just put on. These were the two chief negotiators for Iran, Ali Salehi, for the JCPOA. So who are you going to talk to? You know, is it going to be like MEK? Is it going to be like our deal of the century, which was negotiated between Israel and the United States? I mean, that's not the way negotiations should work. So I think Donald Trump is totally focused on re-election, and I think that from the point of view of the people who support him, rapprochement with Iran is, how should we say, not exactly
on his radar.
Not exactly a high priority.
All right, I think we'd like to open the floor for questions. Go ahead, please.
And if wait for the mic.
What time is it, Jason? Do you have a?
I'm seeing
okay, perfect. Okay, good.
Yeah. And Farnaz, stay with us as long as you can, okay?
I'm Faye Moderator. I'm a member of Atlantic Council. I want to thank Atlantic Council for putting such an outstanding program today. Thank you, Barbara, and thank you for this outstanding panel today. My question is to you, Jason. I'm a big follower of you on Facebook, and I do read your post on Washington Post, and I must say it's the most eloquent and fair and just pieces I have ever read. So thank you for that. The question is, with your history, how effective are you now creating contacts for yourself in Iran to be able to report on subjects and issues that you normally write? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's pretty difficult for me to cultivate new contacts. There are people who I worked with. You know, I was traveling to Iran for 10 years before I moved there in 2009 and lived there from 2009 until I was arrested in 2014. So, you know, I built a real strong network. But as you can imagine, in a country that experiences the sort of brain drain that Iran has over the past couple of decades, it's harder and harder to maintain those ties. I also end up, traveling around the world to conferences and other events where I'm able to engage with Iranians who are visiting. But it's a very different situation than what I was used to before. And, you know, as much as personally I don't want to have a lot of contact with the people who were responsible for holding me for a year and a half, I realized that it makes my work more difficult. And, you know, in a way, part of what I was doing in all the years that I was working there, especially when I became the Post correspondent, I was trying to really transmit the experience, lived experience of Iran to American readers. Now that I'm here in Washington, I feel like a lot of the work that I do, a lot of the writing I do, is intended to really question U.S. policy on Iran. And I've been able, frankly, to engage in pretty fruitful conversations with people in this administration privately. I mean, they don't want to be quoted, obviously. But, you know, on that score, I think I'm pretty effective.
Questions? Wait for the microphone, please. Okay.
Hi, Jason. Now you have been flattered by the lady. I can ask you a question that might be difficult. Yesterday, you published an article in Washington Post. You interviewed Gugush, the superstar Gugush, and in a passage in that interview, you say Gugush is expressing her sorrow about everything, and then you say, or she says, then the killing of Qasem Soleimani that led to the death of hundreds of people, first at the funeral and then the shooting of the airplane. Well, as I know Gugush, I was a bit surprised. I called her and she denied saying this in this sentence. I want to know, what is it? I mean, what is the truth? That's what I want to know.
That wasn't a quote. That was a kind of a description of the state of play where we are between the U.S. and Iran right now.
Exactly, but that has a connotation, right? I mean, led to.
But that's not what Gugush said.
No,
I
definitely did not say that Gugush said that. You know, the quotation marks clearly indicate when someone is quoted. I urge you to go back and look at it. Part of my job in writing a profile of somebody is to give the context of why we're writing that profile. And I think if you go back and read it, it's quite accurate timeline in 3 sentences of what happened over the last several weeks that led to the current situation. But I would never say that Gugush had said that because she didn't.
No, but that has a connotation. Okay. The death of Soleimani led to.
I think Jason made his point. Okay, next question, please. Oh, Hale, I'm sorry. I didn't see you.
It's dark, we don't see you. This is a question to Farnaz, Jason, Nazila, all of you even, and Barbara. You are in touch somehow, indirectly, with relatives, friends, whatever, in Iran. Is your sense that they have given up for change, that there will be a rapprochement with the US or change, and they just are getting on with their lives? At least this is the sense I get. So I just want
Farnaz, go ahead and answer the question.
Farnaz, let's
Well,
start
the
with
question is whether people have given up on change?
Yes.
I don't think they have. I think that, in fact, it's quite the opposite. We've seen as these protests keep percolating and erupting across Iran, we've seen the population's demand get more extreme. You know, 2 years, maybe 10 years ago, during the Green Movement, people were coming out asking for reform, asking to reinstate a candidate within the regime, Hossein Mousavi. Now we see when the protesters come out, when people come out, that they target the entire establishment. They say that we don't want an Islamic Republic. We don't want this regime that would beyond and above reformers and conservatives. So we've seen that people's demands for change become a lot more fundamental as time goes on, as those grievances are not addressed, as those grievances are oppressed, and as people are arrested and killed for demanding change, then their demands have become more and more extreme. So I don't think that the hope and the desire for change at all has been crushed in Iran. I think we've seen it, in fact, keep gaining momentum and spreading. Whether that's going to lead to change is another question, because as my co-panelists pointed out, we don't have a viable opposition leader that can bring all these different groups with their varying agendas under one umbrella, that these protests tend to happen in different pockets with different demands, and they don't seem to come together. We've got students protesting in university campuses after the crash. We had lower income and working class people protesting in November. We've had reformists and sort of middle class, upper class coming 10 years ago coming out. We haven't really seen the convergence of all these different groups coming together and creating the kind of momentum we saw in 1979 with mass millions of protests everywhere, massive strikes that could actually, hurt but we haven't seen that yet. But I do think that the desire for change is very real.
Nazila and then Jason.
It's a very interesting question, Hale June, especially because this is the 41st anniversary of the revolution, and I think we were looking at things slightly differently last year. I mean, last year, certain things hadn't happened. I think since this summer, when the sanctions started really biting hard, and then in November with the fuel price hike, the protests, and then the very brutal response, and then Qasem Soleimani's assassination, and finally the horrifying shooting down of the airliner. I think things have reached a point that the Islamic Republic has to make some serious compromises. I think the plane crash was like the September 11th for Iranians, whether you lived in Iran or you were outside Iran, because it was something that people related to. I mean, people travel there. They have loved ones who are on these planes all the time. And the response was very loud and clear. The reason that the regime lied was because it was very much afraid of that response. So I think the Islamic Republic has reached a point that it has to make a compromise. I'm not sure if that compromise would be political. The compromise may just be a compromise with the United States to come to the negotiation table. But I'm sure that things are going to be different. The desire for change hasn't gone anywhere. But the apathy inside the country has reached a point that I don't think we've ever seen it. I mean, there were some reports that only 8% of the people are going to vote. It was a story Abbas Abdi wrote. I mean, it's never been this bad. And I don't know what kind of strategy boycotting the election is. I mean, it's practically no strategy.
Right.
But if that's what people want to do, that's how they feel, I mean, we're just seeing their response, their attitude. And it shows that they don't support this regime, that they want change, but they don't know what to do. They don't know how their behavior is going to be translated by the regime, and they're just sitting back. I think we have to now watch and see what the Iranian regime will do, what kind of response the regime will give to the situation that it has very much created itself. I think Qasem Soleimani's assassination has put Iran in a position to assess its foreign policy of the past almost 40 years. I mean, there was a point that we believed perhaps Iran has successfully expanded its influence in the region, but his assassination coincided with a time of protests against Iran. I mean, basically because the Islamic Republic had done exactly the same thing it did in Iran. It hired thugs. It put them on stipend. It provided services for them to expand Iran's influence in those regions. And people in Iraq, in Lebanon, they were protesting against it. So that policy has failed too.
You used the word compromise in talking about the Iranian regime, Iranian government. Is that even a word that can be used? Is that something the Iranian government would even consider with the United States as long as sanctions are in place? And I know you got to run, so you go ahead.
I think they're going to have to at some point, right? And and if they don't, that might be the end of the game for them. Ultimately, though, I think what I see, the desire for change is obviously clear and very pronounced. It has been for a very long time. You haven't been in Iran for a few years, but it was pronounced at that time as well. But I think what's different now is the expectation that the people of Iran might have a friend somewhere in the world, right? I don't think that anybody can reasonably say that there's another government or a government in Tehran that has their best interests at heart. And I wonder how that affects apathy and hopelessness.
And so much of the relationship is built on mistrust, Barbara, between Iran and the United States. Lack of hope or, for the future, economic conditions, sanctions. And, U.S. intervention in the past doesn't exactly have a good track record.
I think the coming parliamentary elections, as Nazila pointed out, will be very interesting because I would imagine it will be the lowest turnout we've ever seen. And that is a real sign of disaffection on the part of the public from the nizam, the system as it exists. But where I see the compromise is really more on the social scene. There was a fascinating piece written by the Economist correspondent in the Middle East who got detained in Iran for 6 weeks. They wouldn't let him go. But they very kindly, for most of that time, they put him in a hotel and they let him roam around the city. So he went to every concert, every art show, every cultural event he could possibly find. Oh, sorry.
Not working? This was the Economist correspondent took advantage of his involuntary detention in Iran to really sample the cultural scene in Tehran. And what he described, I recommend this article. I think it's in the 1843 Economist magazine. What he described was in Iran that is transformed even from our time there. Women not wearing scarves, tremendous concerts, women singing, which used to be forbidden. I mean, I remember when I first went to Iran in 1996, the only music was instrumental music on the radio. There was no singing at all except for Quranic chanting. So just an explosion of cultural outpouring and freedom on this level. Nothing to do with the political system. It's like people there have decided, okay, this is a closed game for regime insiders. They can have their little elections and they can fight among themselves over who gets to be the Speaker of Parliament, who gets to be the President, who gets to be this, who gets to be that. And we will live our lives. And I think that comes back to the excellent question from Hala Esfandiari, that particularly for people with means, they are living their lives. They are trying to live, as Azadeh Moaveni once said, as if they were living in a free society rather than under the Islamic Republic. Once you get a situation like this going, it's fascinating. It can give you the raw material for a change in the government at some point. But for that to happen, you need a conducive international atmosphere, and one in which Iran is not being threatened with extinction or obliteration, to use the words of our president, by the world's remaining superpower. So I always tell people who support regime change, whatever that means, that if they really want to see change in Iran, they need to see a change in US policy that will make that possible, that hostility, threats of war, assassinations are going to get you the opposite result politically.
Go ahead. Wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the panel and thank you for the discussions. Based on the hostility and the decline of the relationship of the United States and Iran, what has happened in terms of the other international players? We see Japan, China, European countries stepping in, but not necessarily information that we have firsthand knowledge of. But what is happening behind the scenes with other countries, especially Europe and China and Japan?
Farnaz, would you like to answer that question?
There's been quite a lot of backroom diplomacy going on, parallel to the maximum pressure from both sides. Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is one of the mediators between Iran and the US. There's also the Europeans, French President Emmanuel Macron. These are really the two leaders who've been trying to get Iran and the US to talk unsuccessfully, but these back channels are going on. Oman has also played a very key role in the past. It remains to be seen how that's going to play out in the absence of its former Sultan Qaboos after he passed away. But there's definitely an effort internationally to get Iran and the US to talk. But both sides have conditions. Iran says that the US has to give it something in terms of lifting sanctions or promise of lifting sanctions so it can save face and come to the negotiating table. And the US doesn't want to hand that over without a concrete agreement from Iran. So I think the efforts are there, but the details and the semantics. Right before General Soleimani's assassination, it really seemed like it wasn't a matter of if US and Iran would talk. It was really a matter of how they would do it and what would be the details. In September, at the sideline of the UN General Security, we saw Boris Johnson of the UK and French President Macron really cornering Rouhani in the hallways of the UN and saying, just pretend you're standing by the side of the pool and just jump in.
Yeah, that was hilarious.
What happens? There's a video of that. So that sort of effort is going on, but where will it lead? And also a big question now is whether Iran's Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, will allow a direct US-Iran contact because of Soleimani's assassination. I think that this assassination really casts a shadow on whether this meeting can happen in the Trump administration.
Oh, go ahead, and then Jason.
Just two fingers. The Iranians, even before Qasem Soleimani was assassinated, said that they would only be willing to meet with the United States in a multilateral setting with the other P5 permanent members of the UN Security Council and Germany present. So, Donald Trump had hopes for some sort of photo op with Hassan Rouhani, and that clearly is not going to happen.
Jason.
I also think that there's some real fatigue on the part of Europeans in dealing with all of this, in both sides, right? But I think Iran sometimes likes to think that it has moral high ground in this whole thing, and I don't think that our European partners and allies agree with that. I think that they look at the JCPOA as a good deal that the U.S. should have stuck with, but it's not like Iran is the good guy in this whole equation. And I think, to bring up the case of hostages again, this used to be an American issue. Now it's an issue of
global issue.
Not just global. I mean, it's all of our Western allies that are affected by this. And I think Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, has had this sort of cake and eat it too mentality about doing business in the world. It wants to be respected and considered a major player because it's a vast country with a lot of resources in a very strategic part of the world. But it doesn't want to play by the international rules. You can't have both, right? And I think we're seeing that more and more.
Questions? Go ahead, sir, right there in the middle.
Thank you. I think that so you are criticizing the sanctions against Islamic Republic as a tool to pressure Islamic Republic to come to negotiations. And I assume that you are
who are you talking about?
My question goes to all panelists. You are pro JCPOA, and you think that JCPOA is a good deal. But JCPOA emerged and cultivated in sanctions, and sanctions utilized in Obama's administration to pressure Islamic Republic to come to negotiations. What would happen if you would be able to remove the sanctions and come to negotiation? Was there any JCPOA if you would remove the sanctions?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think I do. I mean, look, sanctions work when they, and if those of you who were here and heard Congressman Hurd, one point that he made that was very important was that we need our allies. So sanctions work when they're supported voluntarily by a large number of countries. That's what brought Iran to the table. This was the European Union stopped buying Iranian oil. The UN Security Council passed a number of resolutions against Iran. There was an international consensus, China, Russia, in support of those sanctions. And then there was a negotiating process in which there was give and take, so that the US didn't get everything it wanted, Iran didn't get everything it wanted. What we have now is a very different situation. We have the US unilaterally imposing not only its own sanctions, but trying to force other countries not to trade with Iran or invest in Iran. And while the Europeans may be not terribly pro-Iran, I can assure you how angry they are about this attempt to force them to follow American foreign policy and not their own sovereign interests. So that's why this policy isn't working, because the sanctions are not truly multilateral. And the other reason, also brought up actually by Will Hurd and others, is what is the goal of the policy? He said it was confusing, and indeed it is confusing. Is it regime change? Is it containment? Is it a new deal? Is it a photo op? What is the goal? And as long as we don't have clarity on that, and we have different voices in the administration articulating different goals, we're not going to have a strategy that can work.
Mm-hmm. Right there, please.
Thank you. I would like to come back to the issue of the attacks on journalists, because I think this is something that everyone is dealing with, and we didn't find a solution. I mean, we have talked about reporting people. I'm not talking about the bots I'm talking about the real people, including the MEK, because they're real people. Even if we don't like them, they're still real. Legal action, I know that this, has been also considered. As someone who is old enough to have seen the opposition before the revolution, I would say, you guys all talked about irrelevance, the fact that there is no one to bring everyone together. The Islamic Republic has been playing very well, not allowing what happened under the Shah by not allowing people to organize. Organized dissent is not possible in Iran.
What is your question? I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yes, so what I'm saying is that when you feel irrelevant, you're angry. So has any of you thought about engaging, the same way you're thinking about the importance of engaging the Islamic Republic leaders and talking to them? Have any of you, as a strategy, and also for your jobs, thought about engaging with these people and see what they have to say and communicate with them?
Jason?
I think when it comes to the MEK, their past history is pretty well known, and their attacks on me have been pretty
brutal,
flagrant, and beyond abusive. So I'm not going to engage with them because I don't think it'd be safe for me, to be honest. But everybody else, yeah. And I've never shied away from a conversation with different groups. I'll say it right now. If Mr. Pahlavi wants to sit down and have an interview, I'd be happy to do that at any point. And others. It's not a problem for me. I think where it becomes problematic, though, is when the nameless and faceless supporters of different figures make personal attacks on us, like the time we're talking about. It's very difficult to engage with those groups and feel comfortable doing so. It's surprising to me that I have to say that in the United States of America in 2020, but that's the way it is.
Farnaz, do you want to give your take?
As journalists, we are open to engaging and having civil discourse and debate with everybody, including our critics who can have a debate or discussion criticizing us in a civic, respectable way. That's what we do. I've certainly always been open. If my job or story that I'm writing requires for me to reach out to any opposition leader or anybody, I will do that professionally. However, if the premise of that conversation starts with slander, with libel, with defamation, with vile attacks, that makes it very difficult to debate and engage. So I think the real question is on the other side. Do you want to engage in what is a democratic discourse, or do you want to engage with the same exact tactics as the regime that you're trying to overthrow? When you do the latter, it really questions their credibility. So I feel that as journalists, we've proven that we're open to talking to everybody. And it's really up to them to pick how they want to talk to us and whether they want to talk to us in a civic, respectable way, whether it's criticism or whatever it is.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, groups like the MEK, I remember when I was writing my book, I spent a great deal of time talking to the so-called National Council of Resistance to try to understand their point of view. I spent hours with one of their spokespeople in Paris to try to understand their point of view. But you know, in recent years, I've been subjected to some pretty horrific attacks by these people that are just beyond the pale of democratic discourse. And I know people, respectable people in the United States who take money from the MEK to appear at their various conferences. And I try to explain to them that this is not a group that would bring a better life to Iranians, that its tactics are I mean, this is an organization that helped make the revolution, after all, and that killed Americans before the revolution when they were part of the movement against the Shah. So, yeah, I agree with Farnaz. I mean, you have to start. I'm happy to talk to anybody who's willing to talk in a respectful way. I'm interested in knowing their ideas, but then I'm gonna come to my own conclusions based on all of the interviews that I've done, and I've interviewed a lot of former MEK members who talk about how they were brainwashed and made to give up their money and their spouses and their children, and it doesn't sound like a very attractive alternative to the Islamic Republic.
Can I add something?
Sure.
I mean, what's going on doesn't seem to be a group of leaders who want to start a conversation. What has been going on is a very toxic environment, and it seems that they want to intimidate and silence whoever that they don't like to hear about, just because they have an opinion that they don't approve of. So it's very hard to negotiate with these people or engage in a conversation with them. And you know, their numbers have grown over the past 2-3 years, and I think there's tons of money behind it. I mean, I don't think there are all these people who are willingly, out of their free time and their personal interest, engaging in hours and hours of sitting at their computer to intimidate others and insult them. I lived in Iran and I worked in Iran for 18 years. It was quite an intimidating environment, but I never saw something like this. I think what's going on is a lot worse than we talk about things going on. I mean, in Iran, they come and put you in prison for 500 days. They torture you, but they don't come after you on social media in vile ways, in vulgar ways, or chase you in a studio. This is just beyond the pale.
He was in a remote studio, thank heavens.
Location, fortunately.
But in front of the camera.
Yeah, live TV.
This is beyond the pale. I don't know if there is room for engagement with these people.
May I add something?
Oh, sure.
As Nazila mentioned, there's a lot of money behind this. There's also a lot of our taxpayer money through State Department programs, like a shameful program called Iran Disinfo, run by people who call themselves human rights activists in Washington. Actually their mission was to identify, target, attack, and harass anyone who doesn't fall in line behind their views of how regime change and war and sanctions should be made. State Department found out, the person behind it was reprimanded, and the program was defunded. I think as we're witnessing this avalanche of really irresponsible behavior and threats, it's really an opportune time for the State Department, for other governments and other organizations that fund these people to really review and see whether their practices fall in line with the practices and norms of democratic behavior and civil society and civic discourse. And if it doesn't, then take appropriate action.
Well said.
And I think our job is to shine light on that angle as well.
Well said, Farnaz. Questions in the far back? We have a gentleman over there.
Thank you very much for the panel. I would like to ask about the role of the Iranian propaganda in influencing the left in the United States, especially given how they see the divide in our country between the left and the right, and they they usually tackle, the left in a way that portrays the Iranian government, like even during the Iranian Revolution, the Shah, they portrayed themselves as anti-imperialist, quote unquote, anti-leftist, and also they were, they had the support of the Communist Party in Iran in 1979, which helped, I believe, the rise of the Shah. The rise of the Khomeini, and that's so.
Okay, let's turn to Barbara. I think Barbara can probably, or Nazila.
The question is about how Iran has tried to cultivate the American left, and I think that's very true. It's absolutely true that they have tried to cultivate the American left. I mean, there are certain people who get visas to go to Iran, and certain people who don't, and they focus on groups, particularly groups that are anti-war. Which is a legitimate effort on their part. I think these anti-war groups have their own very good reasons for having their positions. But they're interesting speakers. I mean, Nazila and Jason and Farnaz can talk about some of the Americans who have been invited to conferences in Iran over the years. Not exactly household names in the U.S. anymore, but still somehow idolized by Iran, and they see themselves, in their own ideology as leading an anti-imperialist front in the world, it's a genuinely believed point of view. So
I know Jason has to leave, so you want to before.
I was trying to think of the name. There's this old lefty. Oh dear, it's gone right out of my head. This old leftist.
Iranian?
No, Americans.
Duke. What was his name? First name?
Yeah. Medea Benjamin is there pretty regularly from Code Pink.
Yeah. This is a philosopher.
Wallenberg.
No, it's an American philosopher leftist. It'll come to me.
Okay.
Noam Chomsky, yes. I have heard more about Noam Chomsky in Tehran than I have ever heard in the United States.
Well,
so maybe you can explain the fascination.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that Iranian authorities and academia are always fascinated with American figures who go against the American grain. On the left, you have somebody like Noam Chomsky. On the right, or way over there, you got somebody like David Duke.
That was
so I think anybody who kind of falls outside the mainstream of America is sort of welcome in Tehran. But to your question, I don't think that they've necessarily been very effective or successful at winning the hearts and minds of the American left. I mean, maybe some figures, but I don't know. I mean, I spent in prison. I had towards the end of my detention access to Iranian state television, which includes Press TV, a multi-million-dollar funded organization, television channel that you've probably heard of. That's the English language propaganda wing of the Islamic Republic. I don't think it's convincing a lot of people here in the U.S. Maybe in other parts of the developing world with anti-imperial trends, but not here.
Jason, thank you. I know
Thank
you got to
all.
run. Let's give Jason a big round of applause.
Thank you.
But we have more questions way in the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Majid Fani. I'm Iranian American. And I have a challenging question with regard to the regime change.
Who is your question for, sir?
I have different points. First, let's start about Farnaz, who said about Iranian president who was kept in dark about the downing of that airplane.
What's your question?
My question is, let's just put ourselves in the shoes of others. And if you say the Iranian president was kept in dark about the downing of the airplane, well, just ask why the Iranian president now, American president, is not kept in the dark. He is just lying on a daily basis. So the challenging question is, we talk about regime change in Iran. And my question is, if we talk about regime change in the US, wouldn't it be faster to start a meaningful dialogue between mainstream Iranians and mainstream Americans? Just look at the history, the past 10, 20, 40 years. Start from Iran, 1953 coup of CIA, American government against Iranians. Then go back to all the invasions, Korea, Vietnam, Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, all of them. Did Iran invaded any country or any neighboring country?
Okay.
So if you ask from the shoes of others, you will see if we have some sort of
I think what's happening here, you're making a commentary and we're short on time. If you could just quickly ask your question, and I think it was directed to Farnaz.
If you want regime change in Iran, we should start with regime change in the US to have a law-abiding government, not to demolish the Security Council, which was approved by all the nations of the world.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on.
I'll take that because we get this quite a lot, sir. We have a very robust Washington bureau at the New York Times that covers every administration, including this one, very professionally and aggressively, and holds truth to power, and has revealed many things about this administration that you've read in the pages of the New York Times. I think that the press in this country, in the U.S., has worked effectively in doing its job to try to reveal and investigate what elected officials do and hold them accountable. It does not, I fundamentally disagree with the fact that our job as American journalists is only to cover our own government. I think that our job is to cover global issues that affect U.S. policy, that affect the world, the security of the world. And Iran is one of those countries because of where it sits in the region, because of its oil resources, because of its military and its influence in the region. It is a regional power, and we have to correctly, accurately, aggressively cover it. As I mentioned before, as journalists, we're not activists, we're not opposition leaders, but I take issue with the fact that you think that we're not allowed to cover Iran. We are. That's our job. And as long as I cover Iran, I will cover Iran the same way that my colleagues cover Washington. We each have defined beats, and we all try to do the best we can.
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, thank you. This is a question for Farnaz. My name is Tom Warwick. I'm a non-resident senior fellow here. And I think I probably speak for all of the policy experts who've been in attendance today, how deeply there was appreciation for the piece that you did on the Iranian decision-making and how the Ukrainian airliner both came to be downed and then how the Iranian government reacted. And to bring two threads full circle, after the strike on Soleimani, all of us expected it would be about 4 or 5 days before the New York Times, Washington Post, other papers would put together the tick-tock of how the American decision was made. And to see what you all put together at the New York Times on how the Iranian decision was made and then corrected or not was an extraordinary piece of journalism. And I bookend what you all did with the comparable piece that came out on China and their reaction to the coronavirus. I'm wondering if there was any reaction from any of your sources in response to the excellent reporting you all did, because it really was extraordinary, and I certainly hope we see a lot more of that kind of thing in the future.
What a great question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate hearing you say that. It took a lot of reporting and legwork and a lot of double sourcing of every bit of string I got. I had to cross-reference multiple times to make sure that what we were reporting was accurate. The reaction I got from sources in Iran was that we had accurately depicted what had happened inside Iran, and that our story was accurate, and it had been read by officials and paid close attention to. The reaction I got from some experts dealing with the legal issues around the airplane was that the piece would serve as an important document in trying to bring hold Iran accountable for this crime, and particularly there was a part in there about a decision to deliberately keep the airport open in order to evade an attack by the U.S., which is taking innocent people as human shields. So there were multiple layers in the story that I got positive reaction. And then I got, as everything else, a negative reaction by the trolls and opposition people that had somehow read this piece to mean that by Rouhani not knowing, somehow the New York Times wanted to exonerate the government, but which was not the case. We set out to really answer the question of who knew what, when did they know it, and if the government, elected government of Iran, if the president, the foreign minister, and the parliament don't know this, then what does this say about the role and legitimacy of an elected government in Iran and who is really in charge? And we tried to address it from that standpoint, but really laying out what our reporting had found and let the facts and the reporting speak for itself. So thank you for reading, and thank you for the kudos. We appreciate it.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we got to wrap things up. Any more questions? No? Well, thank you all. Farnaz, Nazila, Barbara. We so appreciate you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.